Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was halfway through fixing the old wire fence behind my property when I noticed the lanterns swinging. Not the way a breeze would move them. This was different. They swung sharply, almost jerking, and flickered as if someone were trying to shake the flames by hand. I stopped, wrench in hand, and looked around. There wasn't a hint of wind. The trees were perfectly still, the night air heavy and quiet except for the occasional croak of frogs down by the creek. That's when I saw it, a pale, almost bluish-white glow moving slowly along the horizon. I squinted, trying to figure out if it was some kind of vehicle, a plane, maybe even a distant train. But the movement wasn't right. It held the same distance from me, drifting parallel to the ridgeline, almost hovering. I tilted my head, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. Maybe the lanterns were casting some kind of illusion, but the light didn't shift or blur like a reflection. It stayed steady, deliberate. I set the wrench down and walked toward the edge of the clearing, my boots crunching in the dry grass. The lanterns kept flickering, almost in sync, like a heartbeat. I started feeling that pull you get when something is just off. I knew it wasn't a storm, it wasn't wildlife. Nothing natural made things move like this. I raised my hands as if to steady the world itself, but the glow continued, keeping pace along the ridge. I took a couple steps back to grab my flashlight, trying to get a better look. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reach the glow. It was like it existed in its own patch of the night, separate from the woods and the clearing, untouched by my light. I turned the flashlight on and off, then aimed it directly at the horizon. The glow didn't react. It didn't flicker or dim. It just moved, slowly, smoothly, following the line of the hills. I tried calling out to my neighbor, thinking maybe he'd be outside too, seeing the same thing. No one answered. The road down the hill was quiet, not a single car passing. That's when I noticed the lanterns again. One by one, they swung toward the light, not all at once, like it was watching me, testing the distance, deciding how far to pull the flames. I moved closer to the fence post, gripping it, trying to make sense of it. I kept glancing up, following the pale glow as it drifted along the horizon. Then I thought I saw movement within the glow, subtle shifts, almost like it had edges, a faint outline that wasn't just light. My heart started picking up. I tried to tell myself it was a plane, some kind of distant emergency helicopter, maybe a reflection from the town a few miles over. But nothing fit. The motion was wrong, too smooth, almost intelligent, and it didn't make a sound. The night was otherwise normal. No hum of engines, no rustle of wings, nothing. Just the faint swing of lanterns and the glow moving along the ridge like it had its own rhythm. I started walking along the fence, keeping my eyes locked on it. As I moved, the glow seemed to adjust, maintaining the same relative position. I stopped, crouched down behind a bush, and watched for a while. A cloud passed overhead, temporarily shading the hills, and when it cleared, the glow hadn't changed course. It wasn't affected by shadows or clouds. It wasn't flickering with light sources. It just existed. I thought about going inside, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was something compelling about it, something that made my muscles tense and my stomach twist. I kept thinking I could see shapes, maybe limbs, maybe jagged edges, but it was never clear, always just suggestion, as if my mind was filling in the details. After what felt like 10, maybe 15 minutes, I noticed something else. The lanterns stopped swinging. Each one froze midair for a second, like suspended in time, and then slowly returned to normal. I blinked, expecting the glow to vanish with the end of their movement, but it didn't. It continued drifting along the ridge, just as steady as before. I grabbed my phone, hoping to get a photo. I pointed, tapped the screen. The glow seemed almost to recoil, shrinking slightly at the edges, and then it was gone. Just like that. No trail, no flicker, nothing. The horizon was empty, black in the way it always had been, and the lanterns were completely still, their flames now gently swaying with the faint night air. I stayed out there for a while longer, scanning the ridgeline, but there was nothing. My dog had wandered over to me by that point, sniffing the grass, unaware of what had happened. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting it to reappear from the woods, but the night was quiet, normal. When I went inside, I tried to convince myself I'd seen some kind of weird reflection, maybe a distant streetlight bouncing off clouds, but it didn't make sense. The motion, the timing with the lanterns, the way it maintained the same distance as I moved, it didn't fit with anything I knew. I went to bed that night with the image of the glow in my mind. Every so often, I'd wake to a creak in the house or the distant whistle of wind through the trees and half expect it to be outside, drifting along the ridge again. It never did. The next day, I checked the clearing, the fence, even the path along the ridge. Nothing had changed. No evidence, no scorch marks, no broken branches, no unusual tracks, just ordinary grass, ordinary rocks, ordinary trees. I even checked with my neighbor who'd been home all evening. He hadn't seen a thing. Weeks later, sometimes I swear I see a faint blur along the horizon when the night is still, lanterns glowing softly in the yard. I tell myself it's imagination, that I'm remembering the first night too vividly. But part of me knows what I saw was real, whatever it was, something deliberate, moving with intent, untouchable, keeping pace with me, as if it knew exactly where I'd be. I've gone back to work on the fence many nights since, always with the lanterns lit, and nothing else has appeared. Still, when the air is still and the horizon is empty, I can't stop thinking about that pale glow drifting along the ridge, holding its distance, observing, and the way the world itself seemed to pause for it. I had been hiking all morning, taking the trail up past Devil's Rock in the Columbia River Gorge. The sun was already low, spilling gold across the cliffside, and I found a flat spot to rest. I sat down, leaned back on my pack, and just looked out over the valley. The wind was calm, the kind that barely ruffled leaves, and everything felt quiet in a way that's hard to describe. A soft hush that made each sound sharper than it should have been. I noticed something odd almost immediately. The shadows of the trees around me were stretching in strange directions, not following the sun the way they should. Some trees had shadows going sideways, others seemed to bend up the cliff face. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was the angle or maybe the uneven ground playing tricks, but the pattern didn't make sense. It wasn't like the shadows were distorted because of rocks or dips. They looked wrong, as if the light itself had been skewed somehow. I leaned forward on my elbows, scanning the edge of the cliff. That's when I saw it, a faint glow moving across the rocks below me. It was soft, like phosphorescence, but it had shape, a roundness to it, and it wasn't static. It moved slowly along the cliffside, pausing occasionally, then continuing in a straight line before disappearing behind a jagged outcrop. There was no noise, nothing to suggest animals or hikers, and no wind to carry anything reflective. I tried standing up to get a better angle, but the glow had vanished behind the rock. I stayed there for a while, waiting, trying to tell myself it was probably a trick of the light, maybe sunlight hitting some patches of mineral on the cliff. But as the minutes passed, it returned, moving along the same path, pausing at the same spots. It didn't flicker like a flashlight or a phone. It was steady, soft, and oddly deliberate. I sat back down, heart starting to pick up, and took out my phone to snap a picture, thinking maybe it would show something that my eyes couldn't hold on to. But when I tapped the screen, the glow was gone. The cliff looked normal in the photo, just rock, shadow, and a little moss here and there. I stared at it for a long minute, hoping I was missing something. Then something else caught my attention. From the edge of the cliff to the tree line below, the shadows were moving, or at least, that's how it looked. I could swear the lines were shifting subtly, like the trees themselves were stretching or leaning slightly toward the glow's path. I stood up, stepping back from the edge, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. Nothing was making a sound, no wind, no rustle of branches, just that quiet, shifting sensation in the shadows. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my eyes were tired, my brain filling in shapes and movement where there was none. I'd been hiking for hours, sunburnt on the back of my neck, and my legs were stiff. But the movement wasn't peripheral. I could see it when I focused, and it coincided with the faint light that had vanished behind the rocks. I debated going further along the trail to see if the glow would appear again, but my instincts told me to stay put. I crouched down, leaning over my pack for cover behind a low boulder. After a few minutes of silence, the glow reappeared, just barely, slipping along the cliff, hovering for a second on a ledge. I could almost make out a form, like a faintly rounded silhouette, but it was impossible to identify anything. No features, no color beyond the glow itself. Then it simply disappeared again, as if someone had drawn a curtain across it. By this point, my chest was tight, and I realized I hadn't even been thinking about breathing. I tried talking to myself, out loud, in case the sound would ground me. It's just reflection, just light, probably quartz or something. Nothing's there. But the words felt hollow, and my eyes kept flicking to the edge, expecting it to reappear. I decided to pack up and head down before it got too dark. I wanted to move, to feel normal air around me, and maybe the motion would convince my mind that nothing strange was happening. The trail down was steep, and the shadows of the trees still looked off, still stretching in ways they shouldn't. I passed the ledge where the glow had appeared, scanning constantly, but nothing moved. The rocks were just rocks, the trees were just trees, and the fog rolling in from the gorge only made the shadows longer, sharper, more unnatural. I reached the trailhead around twilight, feeling almost embarrassed at my own fear. Nothing followed me. No lights appeared in the distance, and the cars passing by on the nearby road looked ordinary. I kept glancing back toward the cliffs, expecting some sign, but there was nothing, just the growing darkness and the soft rustle of leaves. When I got home, I told my roommate about it over dinner. He laughed, said I'd been staring at the sun too long or imagining shapes in the cliffside rocks. I wanted to argue, but I didn't have anything to show him. No photos, no footprints, no evidence beyond my own memory. And even now, when I think about it, I still feel that shift in the shadows, the deliberate pauses of the glow, the way it moved as though aware of me watching. In the following days, I went back to the trail at various times, early morning, late afternoon, even a little before sunset, but nothing appeared. The cliffside looked normal, shadows aligned with the sun, moss and lichen unchanged. And yet I can't shake the image of that faint light, moving in a way that didn't obey gravity or wind, pausing as if it had intent, vanishing as if it knew I was looking. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see it again. The soft glow creeping across the cliff, the impossibly bent shadows stretching out toward it, the silence that made my own breathing sound loud. I can't explain it, and I've never seen anything like it since. But every time I hike that trail or even drive past Devil's Rock, I glance toward the cliffs, half expecting the glow to reappear and the shadows to twist once more. And though nothing ever does, I know my memory of it is as real as the ground under my feet. I had driven out to Miller Lake that evening just to get away from everything. Work had been a nightmare, and the last thing I wanted was people. My dog Toby was curled up in the back seat, snoring, and the sky was that perfect mix of fading pink and gray just before the sun sinks completely. I parked near the old wooden dock, the boards creaking under my boots as I stepped out. The air was cool, almost damp, and smelled like pine and wet earth. I sat down at the end of the dock, dangling my feet just above the water. Toby trotted ahead to sniff the shoreline, then laid down beside a cluster of reeds. I leaned back on my hands, letting the stillness of the lake wash over me. The surface of the water was nearly mirror smooth, reflecting the sky, the tree line, even me. And that's when I noticed something strange. My reflection didn't move exactly the way I did. I shifted my head slightly, and the reflection lagged like it was caught in slow motion. When I lifted my arm, the hand in the water bent at a weird angle, almost as if it had its own joints, and for a brief second it wasn't even my hand. It looked thinner, paler, almost translucent. I froze, heart thudding, and blinked hard. When I opened my eyes again, my reflection had snapped back to normal. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just the fading light playing tricks. A few minutes passed, and the lake was calm again. Toby let out a soft whine and padded back to me, shaking his fur. I scratched behind his ears and tried to focus on the tree line across the water. That's when I saw it, a tiny glowing shape hovering just above the far shore. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the sun, a trick of light on the water. But no, it was moving, slowly, deliberately, gliding along the edge of the lake. I held my breath, trying not to startle Toby. The glow was faint at first, pale like a soft bulb, not harsh or bright. It drifted upward, rising above the water without any ripples or movement in the air. There was no sound, not even the faintest hum. My stomach twisted, and I felt a cold prickle along my spine. It wasn't like any bird or insect I'd ever seen, and it didn't reflect the light, it emitted it. I grabbed my phone to try to take a picture, but the moment I unlocked it, the glow seemed to hesitate, like it had noticed me. Then, it drifted closer to the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out a shape, but it wasn't solid. Just a small, orb-like light that moved with an almost floating grace. When it passed directly over the water near the dock, the surface rippled slightly, as if reacting to its presence, though there was no wind. I swear, for a second, the ripples seemed to form patterns, tiny waves that spread outward in concentric circles, too precise to be natural. I whispered Toby's name, and he looked up at me, ears perked, then back at the light. It hovered above us for a few heartbeats, then drifted toward the tree line. I could see it weaving slightly, adjusting its path midair as if avoiding branches, though the motion was smooth, like it wasn't constrained by physics. Then it vanished. Just gone. No fading, no flicker, nothing. I stared at the trees, half expecting to see it emerge on the other side, but there was only shadow and wind-swayed leaves. I sat there for a long while, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe a lantern someone had left across the lake. But the movement, the way it rose and drifted without disturbing the air, it didn't match anything I'd ever seen. I kept thinking about my reflection, how it had bent and moved on its own. My hands, my face, even Toby for a moment. Everything had felt slightly off, like the lake itself had a different logic for a few minutes. Eventually, I stood, tugging Toby to his feet. My legs felt heavy, my mind buzzing. I scanned the lake once more, but it was empty, ordinary, mirror-like again. The tree line was just trees, the water just water. I walked back along the dock, every creak sounding loud in the silence, and got into my car. Toby jumped in behind me, shaking water from his fur, and we drove away. I glanced in the rearview mirror at the lake as the tree line passed by. Nothing, just the calm, dark surface reflecting the night sky. The next day, I told a friend about it. She laughed and suggested it was just dusk, my mind playing tricks, maybe the reflection off the water of a distant cabin window. I wanted to believe her, really. But the memory of the orb, the way it floated without wind, without sound, and the way my reflection had moved differently, that stayed with me. Even weeks later, when the light in the sky is low and the water is still, I catch myself thinking about it, wondering if I'll ever see it again. I haven't gone back to Miller Lake at dusk since. During the day, it's just a lake, a dock, trees, and Toby chasing sticks. But I know what I saw. Whatever it wasn't an animal, wasn't a boat, wasn't a reflection. It was something else, hovering above the water, moving like it had its own awareness. And I keep thinking about my reflection, the way it bent and stretched, like the lake itself had shifted for a moment. Every so often late at night, I can almost see that pale light floating over the tree line, just for a second, before it disappears again. I was out jogging just before sunrise, the kind of foggy morning where the world feels damp and muffled, and everything is quiet except for your own breathing and the thump of your shoes on wet pavement. I live in a small town outside of Ashland, Oregon, and the trail I usually take skirts the edge of some low hills and fields that stretch out toward the highway. It's not unusual to see deer or the occasional fox this time of year, but what happened that morning wasn't like anything natural. I had been running for maybe 20 minutes, the fog thick enough that the streetlights left pools of yellow glow, but not much else. The world was gray and blurry, the trees lining the trail barely more than shadows. I was halfway to the hilltop when I noticed them. Small lights moving slowly through the mist across the field. At first, I thought someone was driving a vehicle far off in the distance, but they didn't move like cars. They were perfectly level, hovering maybe 4 or 5 feet above the ground, and there were 6 of them in a precise row moving in unison. I stopped for a moment, catching my breath more from curiosity than exhaustion, and tried to make sense of it. No sound came from them, no engine hum, nothing. And the spacing, they didn't wobble or drift. It was deliberate, almost mechanical, though not in a way I'd seen from drones or toys. I started jogging closer, thinking maybe it was some early morning maintenance crew or hunters using portable lights, but the fog thickened as I approached, and the lights vanished. Just gone. I scanned the area, moving my arms to part the mist, but there was nothing. The field was empty, only dew-soaked grass and the faint shapes of the trees. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably someone setting up lights for a film or a photographer playing with fog effects. But as I turned back toward the trail, the lights appeared again, same formation, moving along the field. This time they seemed closer, though I didn't see any actual source. No lanterns, no vehicles, just the glow. I tried running parallel with them, staying low on the trail, but each time I got within maybe 50 yards, they would blink out, vanish like someone had flipped a switch. I slowed to a walk, confused and a little unnerved, and for the next few minutes, they kept reappearing at random intervals, sometimes ahead, sometimes to the side, always in that perfect line. By the time I finished the loop and headed back to my car, the fog had started to lift, revealing more of the fields and the nearby highway. Nothing looked disturbed, no tracks, no footprints, no tire marks. I kept thinking about it, how precise the movement was, how utterly silent. The pattern didn't make sense, like it was moving with intent, but not in any way I could recognize. I drove home slowly, still unsettled, the fog now patchy but lingering over low areas. I passed the same field again, and for a second I thought I saw a faint glow moving through the mist, just like before. I blinked and it was gone. I shook my head, telling myself to stop obsessing over it. Then about 5 miles down the road, I stopped at a traffic light. When I glanced in my rearview mirror, I swear I saw it, the same faint, hovering lights in perfect formation, trailing behind me on the road. My heart started pounding, and I tried to convince myself it was a reflection. Maybe the red light behind me reflecting in the fog on my windshield. But the lights weren't red. They were soft white, like the glow of a distant porch light, and they moved in perfect synchronization. I flicked my mirror, adjusted my seat, even checked the back window. Nothing. When the light turned green and I drove on, they were gone. Just gone. The rest of the drive home was quiet, normal, but I couldn't shake the image. I kept checking side mirrors, rear view, even my windows, expecting to catch a glimpse again, but nothing appeared. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the fog had cleared completely, leaving the neighborhood looking entirely mundane, ordinary, completely normal. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some local kids with flashlights playing a prank in the fields. Maybe some strange optical effect in the fog combined with my headlights. But nothing fit. The consistency of their movement, the timing, the way they disappeared when approached, it didn't match anything human or natural. That afternoon, I told a friend about it over coffee. He laughed it off, said fog can play tricks, lights can appear to move in weird ways. I wanted to argue, but I didn't have proof, only my own memory. And part of me doubted my eyes, though I knew I hadn't imagined it. Not really. The pattern, the precision, the silence, there was no way to explain it away completely. Later that evening, I found myself driving back from a grocery run along the same stretch of road, thinking maybe seeing it again would put my mind at ease. Nothing. The fog had cleared, the fields were quiet. Still, I couldn't help glancing into my mirrors repeatedly. The images from that morning kept flickering in my mind. Those lights, moving in perfect formation, vanishing when approached, appearing briefly behind me. I kept expecting them to show up again, but they didn't. That night, I went to bed with the window slightly open. Every time I drifted towards sleep, I imagined those lights weaving through the fog, just out of reach, always precise, always deliberate. I couldn't explain them, and I don't know if I ever will. In the days that followed, I kept checking the field, walking the trail early in the morning. Nothing unusual. No lights, no formations, no glowing orbs, just normal fog, normal shadows, normal quiet. But I haven't forgotten how unnatural it felt, the way those lights moved and vanished, and especially how they seemed to appear behind me later in my rearview mirror. Something about that precision, that silence. It wasn't of this world, at least not any world I've ever known. Even now, Months later, I drive that road sometimes. Early mornings, and I find myself glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting them to be there again. The fog comes and goes, the fields stay empty, and the lights don't return. But the memory, the way they moved, is something I can't shake. It's always right there at the edge of my vision, impossible to explain, and completely unnerving. I was outside shoveling snow in front of the house, one of those long, quiet nights where the town feels almost paused. The storm had let up an hour earlier, leaving the streets slick and the fields around our property coated in a heavy layer of white. I'd been working at a slow pace, half thinking about dinner and half thinking about the work week ahead. The snow squeaked under my boots, and my breath hung in the air like smoke. I had the driveway almost cleared when I noticed something over the field beyond our yard. At first, I thought it was a reflection from the streetlights or a plane, but there was no sound, nothing moving in the usual way, just a pale shape hovering maybe 50 feet above the ground. My heart picked up a little. I'm not prone to imagining things, and I've lived here for over 20 years. I know every flicker of streetlight, every shadow the wind can throw across the snow. This didn't belong. I put down the shovel and grabbed my binoculars from the porch. By the time I got them to my eyes, the object seemed to have vanished. My pulse slowed, and I told myself I probably just misjudged the angle or saw a trick of the street lamp. Then, through the binoculars, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of light or movement near the tree line on the far side of the field. Like something shifted, just for a second, and then it was gone again. I squinted, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, the snow reflecting a faint glow from the few scattered lamps in town. The trees were black and solid against the white field. I should have seen movement if anything had been there, but I only caught that quick, almost imperceptible flash twice more. I backed up a few steps, keeping the binoculars trained, and noticed a low hum in the air. Not a car engine, not the power lines, just this steady, quiet vibration that seemed to make the snowflakes hanging in the air shimmer faintly. I lowered the binoculars for a moment, thinking maybe it was my imagination, and the hum disappeared. When I raised them again, nothing. Not a trace. The field was empty, the trees unmoving. I walked closer to the edge of the yard, keeping the snow crunchy under my boots, and tried to see if the movement had been something in the tree line. The snow made it hard to hear, but I thought I caught the faintest snap of a branch, too deliberate to be the wind. I stopped and froze, eyes scanning, ears straining, and the air seemed thicker than usual, like the snow had packed down into something denser. My phone was inside, but I didn't want to break my view. I was trying to convince myself that maybe it had been an owl or a deer, though neither made much sense with the way the shape had hovered earlier. It wasn't a bird, that much I was sure of. And the fact it seemed gone when I raised the binoculars didn't add up either. Things that move in real life don't just disappear like that. I went back to the driveway to finish clearing a strip that would allow me to get the car out in the morning. Every few minutes, I would glance at the field, thinking I saw a slight shift again, something that made me tense up and hold my breath. It was subtle, like a ripple, a faint distortion, but enough to make my skin crawl. Benny, my dog, wandered out from the garage and sat stiffly at the edge of the cleared snow, staring at the field. His ears were forward, tail low but tense, and he didn't move even when I called him. After a while, I started thinking I must be losing it. I'd been outside for over an hour, the cold pressing against my lungs, the wind starting to pick up. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks, maybe the snow or the reflections had been unusual. I laughed quietly to myself and motioned for Benny to come inside. He obeyed reluctantly, but every few steps he would stop and growl softly at the field. Once inside, I set the binoculars on the counter and got a cup of coffee. The kitchen felt warm and normal, but the memory of what I'd seen made me keep glancing out the window at the field. Nothing moved. The snow sparkled under the lamplight from the street, and the trees were black silhouettes against the sky. My hands shook a little. I tried to tell myself I'd been imagining things, but there was that flash at the tree line I couldn't explain. And the way it hovered before disappearing. My mind kept going back to that. I've spent a lot of nights outside clearing snow, walking the property, watching the skies. I know how light falls on snow, how shadows move. Nothing about this felt natural. Around midnight, I went back to the window with the binoculars one more time. The field was completely still, the snow untouched except for the tracks I'd made. No flash, no glow, no shape. Benny was curled up by the heater, eyes half closed. I kept scanning anyway, the hum in my ears from earlier now just an echo in my memory. I finally went to bed, leaving the blinds slightly open. I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hovering shape in the field vanish the moment I looked directly at it. I kept imagining faint flashes moving at the edge of the trees, just out of reach, just beyond clarity. The next morning, the field was empty, untouched by anything strange. The snow was crisp, the wind had settled, and life carried on as usual. I checked the tree line carefully while I shoveled the rest of the driveway, but there was nothing, not even the faintest disturbance. Benny sniffed along the edge of the yard and came up with nothing. I told a neighbor about the weird glow later, thinking maybe he'd seen it too, but he hadn't. They laughed it off as reflections or late-night tricks of the snow. I wanted to argue, wanted to say what I'd actually seen, but I couldn't explain it either. All I had was the memory of hovering light, the flashes at the trees, and the strange vibration in the air. Weeks later, I still think about it when I'm outside. Sometimes I check the field after a snowstorm, just in case. I've gone through the whole scene in my mind dozens of times. The thing that bothers me the most isn't even that I might have imagined it. It's how it moved, how it vanished, and the way Benny reacted. My dog doesn't scare easily, and whatever was out there got his attention in a way I can't explain. I haven't seen it again, not really. But every time I clear the snow from the driveway, I glance at that field expecting maybe a flicker, a flash, something. And each time, I remind myself that for just a moment, the world shifted in a way that made no sense at all. I was walking home from Jansen's Market that night around 10:30, the kind of late that makes small towns feel empty, even if a few cars are still trickling along Main Street. I'd stopped in for milk and ended up wandering around, half paying attention to the stores I passed, half just staring at the cracked sidewalk. It was humid for September, the kind of sticky heat that keeps cicadas singing even after dark. I noticed it first as a kind of rhythm in my peripheral vision, the headlights of the cars moving along Main Street. At first, I thought maybe a car had hit the brakes or someone was messing with their high beams, but then I realized it was every car, all of them, flicking on and off in perfect unison. My stomach dropped a little. There's no reason every headlight on a busy little town street would flicker at the exact same time. I stopped walking, heart beating faster than it had any right to. I looked down at the street. The flicker happened again. Off, on, off, on. Nobody seemed to notice, or maybe nobody wanted to. Everyone else was in their cars, maybe thinking the same thing I was, but looking anywhere but up. And that's when I saw it. I craned my neck toward the rooftops of the storefronts, and for a moment, it was like someone had pasted a sheet of light over the street. A bright white glow, featureless, just hovering a few dozen feet above the roofs. It didn't pulse, didn't shimmer. It just existed. I couldn't see edges or a body or anything like that. Just pure brightness. It lingered for maybe 5 seconds. Long enough for me to notice the way the streetlights seemed dull in comparison. I wanted to blink, but I couldn't make myself. My fingers tingled, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The car's headlights dimmed as if the light above was swallowing everything else. Then it vanished. Just like that. No movement, no sound, just gone. I squinted, half expecting it to reappear somewhere else, but the night went back to normal. The cars kept moving, their headlights steady now, nothing unusual in their beams. The streetlights hummed their usual low buzz. Nothing had changed except for this gnawing feeling in my chest that something had been there and now wasn't. I kept walking, telling myself it was probably a drone or a reflection off some new sign someone had put up. But I'm not the kind of person who believes in things without proof. Still, my mind couldn't shake the fact that nothing mechanical behaves that way. Not drones, not helicopters, not streetlights. I passed Miller's Auto Repair and the neon sign in the window flickered. Normally it buzzes, hums, sometimes sputters, but that night it was synchronized perfectly with the streetlights I'd just seen flicker. I stopped, staring at it, and thought about calling someone. My fingers hovered over my phone, but I didn't know who I'd call that wouldn't think I was losing it. Then the weirdness started in the houses. Windows I passed had lights turning on and off inside, but nothing consistent. Lamps, TVs, maybe even the fridge. I caught a glimpse of my neighbor, old Mr. Callahan, sitting at his table, frozen mid-sip with a glass of water in his hand. He blinked slowly and then went back to whatever he was doing, like nothing had happened. I walked faster. The hum in my ears started. Not a low tone, not a drone, but a static-like vibration, almost like the air itself was carrying a faint signal. I paused, trying to listen, but it would fade in and out. I noticed I was alone on the sidewalk now. Not a soul around me, even though cars were still moving. Every other person had disappeared. Not really disappeared, I could see their headlights, but the streets themselves felt empty, echoing with the weird silence that wasn't exactly quiet. I finally got to my street, the one that dead-ended near my house. My front porch light flickered once as I walked up the steps, not like a normal bulb, but like it had caught something in the air. My dog, Benny, came running out, tail stiff, hackles raised. He wouldn't stop barking at the yard. I tried to calm him, but he kept circling, growling low, then pausing to stare at nothing in particular. I stepped into the backyard to see what had him so agitated. The trees swayed in the wind, the branches rustling, but nothing else moved. And yet, the space above the lawn had that same white glow I'd seen on Main Street, only dimmer, like it was filtering through mist or heat. When I called Benny, the glow vanished, fading into the night so slowly it almost seemed like it had been waiting for me to notice. I stayed outside for a long time after that, flashlight shaking in my hand, scanning the sky, scanning the yard. Nothing came back. The glow didn't reappear. The streetlights outside were steady, the town quiet in that soft, almost unnatural way it gets when it's empty and humid. I eventually went inside, locked the doors, and sat on the couch trying to make sense of it. The hum, the flickering lights, the brief hovering glow, it made no sense. I keep going over the details in my head. The perfect synchronization of the car's headlights, the way it just hovered and disappeared, the backyard flicker, nothing fit anything I knew. The next day, everything was normal. The streetlights worked fine. Cars ran their usual patterns. My neighbor was mowing his lawn. Mr. Callahan had his morning paper. Benny was asleep in the sun. I didn't mention it to anyone. Who'd believe me? The memory was vivid, almost tangible, but nobody else seemed to have noticed anything unusual. It's been weeks now. Every time I'm out at night, I glance up at the rooftops or the treetops. Sometimes when the streetlights flicker just right, I swear I can feel that hum under my skin. And I remember that bright, featureless light floating above Main Street, hovering silently, before vanishing like it was never there. I haven't figured out what it was. Maybe I never will, but I know I saw it, and that's enough to make a quiet town feel different forever. I was up on the roof of our house in Oak Ridge, just messing around with my headphones and my sketchbook. It was one of those nights where the air feels sticky, even though it's early October, and the town had that weird quiet that comes after a long week. My little brother was asleep, my parents were watching TV downstairs, and I'd grabbed a flashlight and dragged a blanket out with me because I wanted to sketch the stars without distractions. That's when I noticed it, sort of out of the corner of my eye. The radio tower behind the old mill, maybe half a mile away, had a shape moving around it. At first, I thought it was a helicopter. There's always something buzzing over the outskirts of town, but this wasn't right. It didn't have lights, didn't make a sound, just a dark silhouette, twisting and tilting around the tower like it was suspended on strings. I squinted, trying to focus, and realized it wasn't following the way a plane or drone would. The angles were wrong, sharp, sudden, like someone had snapped it 90 degrees midair, and it was just there. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but it was still moving, circling the tower, and sometimes shooting out diagonally before looping back. I've never seen anything move that way, not even in a video game. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the tower, thinking that might give me some perspective. Nothing. The shape just kept moving, unbothered by the beam, like it existed in a slightly different layer of the world. I lowered the flashlight, and that's when it climbed higher. Well, climbed might not be the right word. It shifted straight up and disappeared into a patch of clouds. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the night sky. I sat there frozen for a while, sketchbook forgotten. The clouds were just clouds again, the radio tower static in the faint glow of the street lamps down the hill. My brain kept trying to rationalize. Maybe a weird reflection? Maybe a bird? But no bird can move like that. Birds flap, they glide, they bank. This thing twisted and shot and hovered without flapping or banking or slowing down. I started to come down from the roof, heart thudding. But then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was a sound. Low, almost a hum. But it wasn't mechanical. It was subtle, like a vibration through the air rather than sound waves. I stopped halfway down the ladder, straining to hear it, but it faded. I thought I'd imagined it. By the time I was back on the ground, I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to fatigue or the wind or my brain misinterpreting shadows. But the weird stuff didn't stop. I walked into the backyard to grab a bottle of water and noticed the streetlights, 3 of them in a row, were flickering at once. Not 1 or 2, but all 3, in perfect rhythm, almost like they were reacting. I blinked, looked away, and when I looked back, they were steady again. I figured I was seeing patterns where there were none, so I went inside and tried to focus on something normal, TV, phone, anything. But then, the static started. I didn't even have the radio on. It was faint at first, like a whisper under the hum of the house, and then it got louder for a moment, sharp and crackling before fading again. Nothing on the dial, nothing in the room. I tried to tell myself to sleep it off, so I climbed into bed, but the night didn't let up. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a soft movement outside my window. My dog, Max, was growling, low and tense. I pulled the blinds up and for a second thought I saw a reflection of the same dark shape, but it wasn't out there. Just the empty yard, the fence, the faint silhouette of the trees. I rubbed my eyes and it was gone. The next day, everything seemed normal. The tower stood there, silent. The streetlights worked fine. The air didn't hum. I tried to explain it to my friends. They laughed, said maybe I was dreaming or seeing things because I stayed on the roof too long. Maybe. But I know what I saw. There's no easy explanation for something moving in impossible angles, circling a tower without any sound or lights, then vanishing into clouds. A week later, I went back onto the roof with binoculars and sat for a while. Nothing. Just the same old radio tower, the same quiet night sky. But I keep thinking about the way it moved. It wasn't just fast or agile. It seemed aware. Like it knew I was watching, like it was testing the boundaries of the air and gravity. I haven't gone back up there since. The nights in Oak Ridge feel different now. Every time I see a shadow twist too sharply or a streetlight flicker, I remember that shape. And though I try to rationalize, I can't. Something moved that night in ways nothing alive or mechanical should be able to. And whatever it was, it's out there. Even now, when I'm lying in bed and the wind rattles the window, I check the dark patches in the sky, half expecting it to come back. Not hovering, not chasing, just circling, twisting, impossible angles, disappearing into clouds. I still can't explain it, and part of me doesn't want to. I was driving back from a job interview in Bishop, California. It was late, around 11:30 p.m., and the road I took, Highway 168, twists through the eastern Sierra like it was carved into the side of the mountain. I like that stretch at night. There's almost no traffic, the air smells like pines, and the headlights catch the edges of cliffs in a way that feels cinematic. That night, the sky was clear, the kind of dark that makes the stars sharp enough to hurt your eyes. I had the music low, just enough to keep the engine from feeling too loud. About 10 minutes into the winding descent, I noticed a row of lights hovering above the treetops on my right. They were perfectly aligned, like little Christmas bulbs stuck in a straight line and steady, not blinking. I first thought someone was working on a radio tower or maybe a logging operation, but nothing around there had power lines or equipment. The lights didn't have that warm orange glow of a streetlight either. They were cold, almost white. I slowed the truck to get a better look. The road was empty except for me, the yellow lines smeared by my headlights, the trees dark and dense on either side. When I blinked, honest, I literally blinked and looked back, the lights were suddenly miles ahead of me, still hovering just above the treetops. I could see the road curving up ahead and the lights were tracing it perfectly, moving with me. Not slowly, like they were floating with the wind, but keeping pace. I rubbed my eyes. I checked the rear view mirror, thinking maybe it was a reflection, a trick from my windshield or the dashboard, but the mirror showed nothing. The lights were only on my right, advancing along the tree line. I lifted my foot a little, speeding up, and they did the same. They matched every turn, every incline, moving as if tied to my truck. I tried to keep calm. I'm not someone who panics at the weird, but something about the precision of those lights made me tense. I toggled the high beams to see if they were solid objects or something else. The beams didn't reflect or scatter, no outline, no shimmer, just the same row of lights, silent, following the curves of the road. I thought maybe someone was messing with me, a prankster with drones, but these weren't drones. Too high, too long, too steady. And I hadn't heard a single motor, no buzz or hum. The air was completely still. The only sound was my truck's engine and the tires on asphalt. I reached for my phone to record, but it slipped slightly in my hand. I think I knocked it when I adjusted the seat. And when I looked up again, the lights were gone. Just black trees, dark sky, stars. I slowed to a crawl, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I felt exposed, like the mountain itself was quiet and too empty. I decided to keep going, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I started paying attention to the turns, the dips, trying to see if something would appear again. Around a blind curve, I noticed them a second time. Same alignment, same hovering above the treetops. Not flashing, not moving like they were propelled. They just glided over the tops of the pines. I couldn't see a craft or outline, just the lights in perfect linear formation. I pulled over at a turnout to think, trying to rationalize. My first thought was that they were cars on a parallel road, maybe some logging track, but there isn't one, and nothing makes sense with the way they stayed perfectly over the treetops. The tree line is rugged there. No vehicle could be that consistent or maintain that height over the mountainside. I watched for a few minutes. They didn't change pattern, didn't blink, didn't emit sound. The line of lights seemed aware of my presence, keeping a pace with me, but I didn't feel like I was being threatened. More like studied or noted. I shook my head and got back in the truck. For the rest of the drive down the mountain, I didn't see them again. I watched every curve, every shadow, expecting them to reappear, but the descent was quiet. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting that cold white glow to hover there, tracing me again. By the time I hit the flat desert outside Lone Pine, I was on autopilot. My hands were tight on the wheel. I tried calling a friend, anyone, to talk it out, but no one answered. It felt silly to try to describe what I saw. Too precise, too impossible. But it stayed in my head like a memory I couldn't dismiss. At home, I checked the road on maps and satellite views the next day. Nothing there. No structures, no parallel roads, nothing that could explain the lights. I drove the route again in daylight a week later. The forest was dense, uneven, treetops jagged. There was no path that could let something hover in that formation, much less move silently in perfect cadence with my truck. I've told a few people. Most laugh or nod politely or assume it was drones or lights in the distance. But it didn't feel like drones. Too high, too quiet, too controlled. It wasn't something I could chase or follow. It was everywhere I was, and then gone when I blinked. I've been back to that stretch of highway a few times, both day and night. Never saw the lights again. But every time I drive there now, I check the treetops, scanning the black folds for the same row of cold white lights that once hovered perfectly, like they were measuring me. I don't know what they were. Maybe nothing anyone else would notice. Maybe something that follows in silence, just to see who passes by. It was the kind of thing that shakes your sense of ordinary reality, quiet but insistent, not terrifying in a scream sense, more insistently wrong. And for weeks afterward, every straight line of lights, every reflection or glare, made me glance twice. wondering if they'd come back, gliding silently above the trees, keeping pace like they did that night. We pulled into the driveway in that quiet, slow way people do when they're the last ones leaving an evening and you don't want to wake anyone up. It was almost 10, a cool November night, with a fine drizzle that made the street lamps bloom soft halos. Claire was in the passenger seat rubbing the back of Emma's neck. Our 7-year-old had dozed off, and Noah was still going over his spelling list under the glow of his phone, even though he should have been asleep an hour earlier. The porch light started flickering before we could kill the engine. Rapid, like somebody hitting the switch on and off with a rhythm you'd only hear if you were right there. I thought for a second it was the old bulb finally giving up, or the house wiring acting up. This place is older than any of us. Huh, I said, turning to Claire. She frowned and stepped out to open our umbrella. The front of the house threw back weird shadows in the interrupted light. That's when Noah said, "Dad, look." He was halfway out of the car, phone dropped on the seat, face pale because the drip from the hood of his hoodie had woken him. I followed his eye over the roofline, past our neighbor's maple tree, and into the sky. There was something there, moving slow and deliberate across the band of clouds. At first I thought it was a plane, a searchlight catching low cloud, something routine, but it wasn't a point or a streak. It was an oval, soft-edged, and white, like somebody had cut an egg out of paper and stuck it up against the clouds. It moved without sound. You could hear the rain against the windshield and the tires settling on the gravel, but nothing else. No engine, no rotor, in fact, nothing that would explain a thing that size being over our block. The porch light did that fast flicker again, and it seemed to pulse in time with the oval's slow glide. Emma stirred and muttered, then sat straight up and pointed. "Is it a balloon?" she whispered. That was the kind of question kids ask because it's the one thing they're allowed to be wrong about without anyone laughing. I almost answered with maybe, but the oval didn't bob like a balloon. It maintained its orientation, moving like it was riding a current, only it could feel. I got out and left the car door open because my keys were in my hand and I didn't want to fumble. The air was colder than it had been that evening. A neighbor's door across the street opened and a man stuck his head out, then shut it again like he didn't want to be seen. Mrs. Delaney over the fence, she's early to bed, turned on her porch light, but her light was the normal orange spill. It didn't match ours at all. As the oval passed over the block, it dimmed everything beneath it by a kind of negative light, like the stars were being erased instead of covered. Claire grabbed Emma closer and leaned toward me. "Should we go inside?" she asked. Her voice tried to be calm. It wasn't. I hate that my heartbeat sounded like somebody else's. Part of me wanted to call someone. 911, the township non-emergency number. Because what do you do when a white oval drifts across your sky at 10 o'clock and you can't hear it? The sensible part of my brain said to document it. The father part said, don't let your kids see you scared. Noah had already pulled his phone out and was filming. I made a dumb joke, get his good side, and he laughed once, mechanical, then fell oddly silent as he tilted the screen up. The video shows gravel and wet leaves and the edge of our roof, and then the oval, white and steady, skimming past the treetops. When I watched it afterward with the rest of them, the sound on the clip was just tires and distant rain. The oval came through as a bright, wrong smear. The phone battery, which had been at 80% 5 minutes earlier, showed 38 and blinked low for a second like something had tugged at it. That was the second little odd thing we noticed. Another small thing. The street that usually carried a faint hum from the highway 2 miles over fell totally silent. No faraway truck, no high-pitched insect noise. Even the old maple that usually whispered in the wind didn't rustle. The world had narrowed to our small yard and this unaccountable light moving as if it were on its own timetable. It moved slowly across the neighborhood, big enough to blot out the higher-up stars, and as it did, a few more lights in the sky popped on. Blips, not plain lights, closer to pinpricks that seemed to hang in a loose curve around the oval like an audience. They didn't move on their own. They mirrored the oval's path, keeping a steady distance. If you squinted, they looked deliberate. I forced my hands to unclench from the keys and walked to the edge of the lawn. My feet made little wet prints in the grass. The porch light's flicker finally stopped, and then it went out altogether for a breath, which was the strangest because the rest of the block remained lit in the normal ways. For a fraction of a second, the oval was the only light we had. White, omnipresent, impossible to look at without wanting to squint. And then, like somebody had decided to end it, a quick wave and it was dimmer, became more like a glow, and then it lifted. Not fast, like a balloon, but upward, smooth and steady until it passed the roofline and the top edges of the trees and, just like that, was gone. No noise. No afterspark. One moment the sky held a shape and a presence, and the next it was empty, as if it had never been. The neighborhood sounds filled back in like a curtain being dropped behind it. Mrs. Delaney's radio came through, someone's dog barked down the street, and the highway hummed faintly like nothing had cut across it at all. Our porch light came back on, steady and yellow, like a small apology. Inside the house, we all moved without thinking. Claire pulled the door closed and locked it. Emma rubbed at her eyes and said very simply, "It went away." Noah kept the phone pointed at the ceiling like he was expecting the thing to drop back through the roof. I checked the breaker box because people tell you not to jump to conclusions, and everything read normal. The little LED of the smoke detector blinked its routine. The refrigerator hummed away like a dull engine. Normal life. We tried to talk it into a neat explanation. Air show? No, nothing planned around here. Military flares? We'd have heard something. Drones, they make noise when they're that close. Balloons, the math doesn't work. The kids came up with stories, a guardian star, a cloud with a face, but Claire just made tea and moved slowly, like someone cataloging the ordinary things that would prove safety. Later, after the kids were in bed and the house finally quieted properly, I stood at the living room window with a cup of tea gone lukewarm. The sky was the same in every technical way, same clouds, same sprinkling of stars, but something had shifted in how I thought about it. The oval hadn't done anything dramatic. It hadn't swooped or flashed or chased us. It moved with an odd, considered slowness and vanished without a sound. There was a small catalog of stray, inexplicable things, battery drain, lights strobing, the hush on the street, that I couldn't fold cleanly into anything I know. I didn't call anyone. Who would you call for that? I checked the footage again before I went to bed, watched the quiet oval slice across pixelated night, listened to the rain on the roof. The clip showed what we saw, a white shape, a slow crossing, a disappearance. No extra noise, no ghost passengers, no supernatural signature. Just a thing that hadn't been supposed to be there and then wasn't. We slept because kids sleep and bills need paying, and tomorrow is stubbornly workaday. In the morning, the yard was normal. Wet grass, a few fallen leaves, the porch light behaving like a dutiful bulb. The only evidence was the memory in our heads and the video file on Noah's phone that everyone looked at a little too often that day, passing screens around like a shared secret. Sometimes that night comes back to me in pieces. A pause in the wind, a light that seems a touch too steady for the sky. I find myself glancing up when I'm out loading the car or walking the dog, more by habit than belief. The street is ordinary the rest of the time. Kids on bikes, small repairs to roofs, someone putting out trash. But for a few minutes that night, normal got quietly interrupted by something that didn't explain itself, and then it left. We were home. We were all there. Life simply carried on with a small, unexplained gap where the sky briefly held something white and slow and completely silent. We set up camp near the edge of Pine Hollow in northern Vermont just past dusk. The forest was thick, the kind that swallows the sun before it even reaches the horizon. I was with 3 friends, Mia, Josh, and Caleb, and we'd been planning this weekend for months. A couple nights in tents, a fire, no phones, just woods and stars. The first evening was uneventful. We cooked hot dogs, told dumb stories, and tried to ignore how quiet everything was. I was the first to notice it, actually. I'd gone a little off the trail to stretch my legs and grab some water from the creek. The forest was settling into that deep night hush, wind in the branches, the occasional snap of a twig, but then I saw it. A dim red light, flickering faintly, weaving between the trees maybe 50 yards away. Not steady, not like a headlamp. It moved with a strange rhythm, almost gliding, darting left and right like it was searching. At first, I thought it was a flashlight from another group of campers. There weren't supposed to be any other groups this far in, but it made sense. Someone wandering in the woods late at night. I called back to the others. Hey, you guys see that red light? Mia and Josh came over to the edge of the clearing where I was standing. Caleb stayed back near the tents, fiddling with a lantern. Probably another camper, Mia said. Maybe lost. But she didn't sound sure. Neither did I. We decided to approach it. The light kept moving, weaving between the trunks, and we followed carefully, keeping voices low so we didn't spook whoever it was. The forest floor was damp, covered with fallen leaves, and the smell of pine was strong. Every step felt loud. The light didn't get closer or farther. It just moved along the tree line in patterns that didn't make sense, like it was aware of us following. Maybe it's one of those little laser pointers, Josh suggested, though his voice was tense. We pushed a little further. I kept my eyes on the red glow, trying to figure out where it originated. Then, just as we reached the point where the trees opened up a bit, the light lifted. Slowly at first, then faster, straight up into the air. No sound, no rustle of leaves, no twang of a string, nothing. Just gone. It left no trail, no shimmer, nothing but the empty night and the smell of wet leaves. We stopped, frozen. Mia whispered, What was that? I shook my head. I don't know. Not a person, not a drone, nothing I've ever seen. We walked back to camp, all of us quiet. Caleb had come over when he heard us calling and wanted to know what was going on. We tried to explain, but the words felt hollow. Even as we talked, we were glancing up at the trees, half expecting the light to return. It didn't. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of a branch, every snap of a twig made me sit upright in the tent. Rustling leaves sounded like movement, like the red light had left something behind, something watching. The others felt it too. We whispered to each other in low voices, though I'm not sure if it was for comfort or to convince ourselves it was just nerves. The next morning, the forest seemed normal. Birds called from the treetops, the creek bubbled along its course, sunlight filtered through the canopy. Nothing unusual. We hiked around a bit, scanning the area, looking for signs of whoever or whatever had been there. No footprints, no discarded gear, no sign of human activity. The soil was damp, no marks. On the drive back, the road winding through the pines, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a flicker of red behind us. Nothing. Josh kept shaking his head, saying maybe we'd been seeing things, playing tricks on our eyes in the dark. Mia didn't say much. Caleb kept looking out the window silently, hands clenched on his knees. We've talked about it since, sometimes when we're hanging out. None of us can make sense of it. The patterns, the way it moved, the fact that it vanished without a trace, it wasn't normal. It wasn't human. It didn't belong in the forest, at least not in any way we've ever seen. Sometimes I imagine going back to Pine Hollow at night, retracing the path we took. But part of me doesn't want to. Part of me remembers the way that red light moved, like it had a mind of its own, and I'd rather not know if it's still there, waiting between the trees. I haven't seen anything like it again. Not in the woods near my town, not on hikes in other states, nowhere. And yet, when I think about it, there's this lingering sense that whatever it was didn't leave entirely. That faint feeling deep in your chest, like you're being watched, but you don't know from where or why. It was a small thing, a little red light, but it changed how I feel about the woods. Quiet nights aren't quiet anymore. Shadows aren't just shadows. And when the wind rustles through pine needles, I catch myself holding my breath, hoping it's nothing, hoping it's just the wind. I woke up to the sound of Rusty whining. At first, I thought it was just a dream. It was around 2 a.m., and my bedroom clock glowed 2:03 in red digits, but the whining didn't stop. Then came the scratching at the door, sharp, urgent, like he was trying to get me to move. I rubbed my eyes, sat up, and listened. My little golden retriever never does this. He's usually content sleeping at my feet. I slid out of bed by pulling on a sweatshirt and bare feet on the cold hardwood. The house was silent apart from Rusty, whose whining had risen to a soft bark. I called his name. Rusty, what is it? The sound didn't answer me, but it kept him at the door. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the back door. The air hit me immediately, humid, damp, still. I live in a small house on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, and the backyard backs up to some wooded lots that stretch for a mile or more. Normally, nights like this are dark, almost pitch black once you pass the porch light. But the backyard wasn't dark. It was lit in this pale, almost white glow. Not bright like a floodlight, not warm like a lamp, just pale, diffuse light that covered the yard in a soft haze. It didn't have a source that I could see. No lamp, no moon reflecting oddly on the clouds, nothing. Just the glow, casting shadows from the trees, the fence, even Rusty standing at my feet. I froze, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. Rusty barked once, then sat, staring into the yard. The air smelled different too. Not bad, exactly, just sharp, almost sour, metallic. I stepped onto the grass, barefoot, and the dew was wet, cold. My hands shook. "Hello?" I called, voice trembling, though there was no reason to expect an answer. The glow didn't pulse or flicker. It just hung there, still, like it was waiting for something. Rusty's ears were up, alert, and I noticed he was tense, body low, tail stiff. I lifted the flashlight and swept it across the yard. Nothing moved except the light catching on the dew on the grass. And then, when I spoke Rusty's name again, the glow began to fade, almost like it was aware of me calling out. I froze in the half-light, my breath visible in the cold night air, watching it dissolve into the darkness. Within a few seconds, it was gone. The backyard was normal again, the trees dark, the fence just a black line in the night, and Rusty sniffing the air, ears still pricked. I stayed there a long time, just standing, waiting for it to return. Nothing. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe a reflection from the streetlights a mile away, maybe the moon hitting a thin layer of fog. But the air had felt different, thicker somehow, with a low vibration I could feel in my chest. And Rusty, usually unbothered by lights or shadows, had acted like something was there that he couldn't ignore. I finally went back inside, but I left the back door open, just a crack. Rusty stayed at the threshold, watching. I brewed some coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and kept listening. Every little sound in the neighborhood seemed sharper, the rustle of leaves, the far-off bark of another dog, but no glow returned. By the time morning came, I had almost convinced myself it had been a trick of the mind. The dew sparkled in the sunlight, the backyard looked completely normal. Rusty lay on the rug in the living room, snoring softly. But even with daylight, I could still feel it in my chest. That same low, strange vibration, like the night had shifted for a moment into something else, something I didn't understand. Later, I checked my neighbors' houses. Nobody had seen anything. No lights in the sky, no unusual sounds, no glowing backyards. Just me and Rusty, standing in the yard with a memory of something that wasn't supposed to be there. I haven't seen it since. I've checked the yard on other late nights, kept the porch light on, even called Rusty's name into the dark. Nothing. But sometimes, when the air is heavy and the night is still, I swear I feel that same tension, that same hum in the chest, like the glow could return at any moment. I tried talking to a friend about it once, someone who's been into hiking and night photography. She said sometimes the atmosphere can catch light in strange ways, make the fog glow, make the dew shimmer, but it wasn't like that. There was nothing to bounce light off of. It was just there and gone. Rusty is fine. He doesn't act scared anymore, though I notice him staring at the backyard sometimes long after I've gone inside. And me? I check the yard sometimes before bed, but I don't wait outside anymore. I just remember it. The pale glow, the smell in the air, and that odd feeling that something had been there, watching us, then leaving as soon as I spoke. I was on the East Ridge Trail in the Rockies, somewhere above Timberline, maybe 10 miles from the nearest road. It was early September, a crisp morning with a thin layer of fog hugging the lower slopes, and I'd gotten a late start because I wanted to catch sunrise at the summit. I'd done this hike a few times before, but that day it felt different. Quiet in a way that wasn't usual for the mountain. Even the birds weren't singing much. I had my pack with water, snacks, the usual gear, and I was moving slow because the trail was steep, loose in places, and my legs were still stiff from the drive up the day before. About 20 minutes after I passed a bend near a scree slope, I saw it. A flash of silver, hovering, or drifting, I'm not sure, just above the ridge to my right. At first, I thought it was a reflection from my headlamp catching on some loose rock, or maybe a trick of the fog. But it moved, slowly, almost deliberately, along the contour of the ridge. No sound, no wind, no rotor wash, no anything. It was just there, sliding behind the ridge like it was gliding. I stopped and squinted, shading my eyes with my hand. The sun was still low, a pale orange, and the reflection was bright against the gray rocks. I fumbled in my pack for my binoculars. My hands were shaking, cold and sweaty at the same time. I trained them on the ridge. The silver shape was smooth, featureless from my perspective. Maybe the size of a small car, maybe bigger. I couldn't tell because there was nothing near it to judge scale. It didn't rise, didn't fall, just drifted horizontally, keeping pace with the ridge as if it was following it. I debated climbing a little higher to get a better look, telling myself it was probably just a reflective kite or a drone someone was testing. But it wasn't acting like either. Its movement was too steady, deliberate, and too high to be a kite. Drones usually buzz, even when far away, and I didn't hear anything. I kept my eyes on it as I pushed higher up the trail, stepping over roots and loose rocks, trying to keep it in view. When I reached a vantage point where I should have had a clear line of sight over the ridge, nothing. The silver object was gone. No flash of light, no glint, no reflection. Just the ridge, the fog settling low, the loose rocks shining faintly in the morning light. The silence was strange. Even the wind that usually blows across that ridge was muted. And then I heard it. Crackling. Like static, a faint, high-pitched hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't constant. It would flare for a second, then die down, like a radio being tuned but not quite hitting a station. I froze, leaning on my hiking poles, scanning the ridge and the valley below. The static grew a little louder, closer, then faded again. I didn't see anything moving. My stomach tightened. I wanted to call out, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the mountains. I stepped back from the edge of the trail, lowering my binoculars. The static was still there, low and intermittent, almost like it was echoing between the rocks. I moved a few paces down the slope, trying to get away from it, but it didn't seem to change in volume or location. I fumbled with my phone to check the time and signal. Nothing. No bars, no GPS, just the usual no service icon that comes with high mountain ridges. I tried to record the sound, but my phone mic barely picked up anything, just a faint hiss, like a whisper. I debated heading back down immediately, but my curiosity kept me rooted. I wanted to understand, to see it again. I climbed another few hundred feet, moving along the trail to a small outcrop that overlooked the valley on the other side of the ridge. Still nothing. No silver, no reflection, nothing except the fog settling in pockets between trees and boulders. The static persisted, faint, sporadic, as if the mountain itself was whispering in a language I didn't know. I stayed there for a while, just breathing and listening, trying to convince myself it was a natural phenomenon. Maybe atmospheric interference, maybe some strange echo from a far-off radio signal. But the rational explanations didn't make the sensation in my chest go away. That tightness, that awareness that I was not alone, even if nothing visible was around. Eventually I started back down. My legs were sore, my mind racing. The fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing the valley, the trail, the familiar scree slopes. The static had faded entirely by the time I got back to the forested section, replaced by the normal morning sounds. Birds, a distant waterfall, leaves rustling. I checked the ridge one last time before turning toward the trailhead. Everything looked normal. No silver object, no flicker of light, no sign that anything unusual had passed through. I kept my binoculars around my neck, half expecting to see it again, but there was nothing. When I got back to my truck, I stared at the horizon for a long time, thinking about what I'd seen, or maybe thought I'd seen. I called my friend Mark, who hikes the area all the time, asking if he'd noticed anything unusual in that section of the trail recently. He laughed, said he hadn't, and suggested I was seeing reflections or losing it from fatigue. I wasn't tired. I was alert. Everything about it was deliberate, the slow drift of the silver object, the absolute silence, the crackling static that came right after it vanished. I drove home slowly, keeping my eyes on the mountains, scanning the ridges and valleys. I've hiked that trail dozens of times since, never seen anything like it again. But sometimes, when the wind is quiet and the fog is low, I swear I can hear that faint static in my head, and I remember the ridge, the silver shape, and the feeling of being watched by something I couldn't identify. I stepped out onto the porch around 11:30 p.m. just to get some air. It had been one of those sticky August nights where the house feels like it's holding heat from the day, and even with the ceiling fans on, nothing really cools down. I leaned on the railing, listening to the crickets and the occasional dog bark from a neighbor's yard. My name's Tom, by the way, and I live out in the country near Fairview, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just a small place with a big backyard, some woods at the edge of the property, and a gravel road that runs past the house. I was halfway through a beer, just relaxing after mowing the lawn earlier in the day, when I noticed a light. At first, I thought it was a flashlight from someone walking the neighbor's property, or maybe even a reflection from a passing car on the gravel. But it wasn't like that. It was a beam, sharp and bright, moving slowly across the tree line at the far end of my yard. Not flickering, not swinging like a porch light. It was steady, slicing through the dark like a spotlight. I squinted, trying to see if I could catch whatever was producing it. No plane, no helicopter, no glint of something metallic. The sky was clear enough to see the stars, a few clouds drifting far off to the east. But the light kept sweeping, moving from the left side of the tree line to the right, slow and deliberate. I leaned forward on the railing and scanned the yard. Nothing stirred in the woods. No deer, no raccoons, nothing. Just the trees and shadows. My dog, a lab named Hank, had been asleep on the porch steps, but he perked up at the beam too, ears forward, head tilting like he couldn't figure out what it was. I grabbed my flashlight from the porch table, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the beam, half expecting to see a hunter or some kid messing around. Nothing. The beam swept past where I shone the light, steady, unaffected. It was like my flashlight didn't exist. I took a step down off the porch, boots crunching in the gravel, trying to get closer to the edge of the yard. Hank followed, low to the ground, growling softly. The beam stopped for a second, as if it noticed me moving, then started again, sweeping across the tree line with the same slow rhythm. I tried calling out, "Hey, who's there?" But my voice sounded small in the night. No response. Not even the rustle of leaves that usually comes with someone moving through the woods. Just that beam, slicing through the darkness, perfectly even. I thought maybe it was a drone with a spotlight. I looked up, scanning the sky, but I couldn't see anything. No lights, no sound, nothing. The wind was barely moving, not enough to carry any engine noise from a drone or plane. I even tried whistling just to see if anything would react, and Hank barked once, low and tense. That was it. I stood there for a long while, watching it sweep back and forth, the hairs on my arms sticking up. Time felt weird. Usually, I could hear a truck on the gravel road at least once in an hour, or a train horn from miles away. But this night, it was just the beam and me and Hank. Eventually, I went inside, thinking maybe I was imagining it or that someone had a strong flashlight on the neighbor's property. I shut the porch door, leaned my head against it, and listened. Hank settled back onto the floor by the door, but he kept his eyes on the window, ears forward. I kept the blinds open, trying to see if the beam would come back. It did. A few minutes later, a thin slice of light passed across the window, casting shadows of the treetops in sharp relief on the floor. I froze. I could see the beam moving slowly across the yard, just at the edge of the trees, and there was still nothing in the sky above it. No sound, no movement, no wings or rotors, nothing. I grabbed my binoculars from the shelf in the living room and aimed them through the window. The beam was steady, sweeping like a slow searchlight. Even with the binoculars, I couldn't see a source. No casing, no drone, no vehicle, just the light, as if it had materialized from nowhere. I sat there, holding my breath, watching it. My stomach tightened, my hands a little clammy. I had no idea what I was looking at. Time passed in some distorted way. A minute felt like 5. Then the beam slowly rotated upward, moving higher above the trees, and eventually it just stopped. And after a few seconds, it vanished, like it had never been there at all. Hank growled once more, low, then went back to sleep. The yard looked completely normal again. No tracks, no flashlights, no reflection on the leaves, nothing. The night was quiet, the stars back in place. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept checking the window, checking the yard, thinking maybe it would return, but it never did. In the morning, everything was normal. Dew on the grass, birds chirping in the trees, the gravel road quiet except for the occasional car passing. I told my neighbor about it a few days later, a guy named Greg who keeps goats up the road. He shrugged. Said maybe a spotlight from a hunting club, maybe a reflection from a distant farm, but nothing lined up. He said he hadn't seen or heard anything that night. I still drive past that tree line sometimes at night, and every once in a while I catch myself staring at the edge of the woods, waiting for the beam. It hasn't come back. Not since that night. But I remember how real it felt. How deliberate. How it moved across the trees as if it were searching for something. And the part that gets me most is that I never saw a thing making it. Not a plane, not a drone, not a helicopter. Just a perfect, silent spotlight cutting across the night. I was driving back from my sister's place late one Sunday night. She lives about an hour away from me in this little town outside Springfield. I'd stayed later than I meant to. She made dinner, and we ended up talking on her porch until it was past 9. By the time I got on the road, it was already dark. It was a clear night, no clouds at all, just stars overhead and the long black line of highway stretching ahead of me. The drive is mostly rural. 2-lane roads, cornfields, occasional clusters of trees. I usually don't mind it, but that night I was tired. The kind of tired where you keep telling yourself, just 20 more minutes. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock as I passed a big red barn I always use as a landmark, 10:13. I remember the numbers clearly because I was doing the math in my head, figuring I'd be home by 10:40 if I didn't hit any deer or tractors on the road. The next thing I knew, the clock said 10:47. I blinked at it a few times, like maybe it was glitching, but the numbers stayed there, glowing steady. My headlights were hitting a stretch of highway I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. I was miles farther down than where I should have been. It was like I'd skipped over part of the drive. I didn't remember stopping. I didn't remember drifting off. I didn't even feel groggy, just suddenly aware that half an hour had vanished. I slowed way down, pulled onto the shoulder, and sat there with my hazard lights on. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept checking the mirrors, the dark fields on either side of the road making me feel exposed. I tried to retrace in my mind. I remembered passing the barn at 10:13. I remembered a curve in the road maybe 5 minutes later, and then nothing until that glowing 10:47 on the dash. No songs on the radio, no headlights of oncoming cars, no stretch of road, nothing. When I finally pulled back onto the highway, I drove slower than usual, scanning every sign and landmark. That's when I realized I was at least 15 miles farther down than I should have been. I hadn't missed a turn, I was still on the right road, but the distance didn't make sense. My chest was tight the whole drive home. The sky felt darker than usual, like the stars weren't quite where they should be. I kept flicking my eyes to the mirrors, like half convinced I'd see headlights tailing me, or worse, something else in the back seat. When I got to my house, it was just past 11. I sat in the driveway with the engine running, staring at the clock, waiting for the minutes to do something strange again. They ticked normally, one after the other, no skips. Inside, I checked my phone to see if maybe I'd texted or called someone during that missing time, but there was nothing. No calls, no notification. The weirdest part was that my gas gauge had dropped more than it usually does for that drive. Not a lot, just enough that I noticed. I didn't sleep much that night. I just lay in bed, replaying it over and over, that jarring jump from 10:13 to 10:47, like somebody cut out a section of tape and spliced the ends together. I woke up before dawn because of a noise. It wasn't a creak from the old house or the wind rattling the roof. This was different, a low, metallic hum, constant and vibrating through the walls and windows. I sat up in bed, rubbed my eyes, and listened. The hum wasn't coming from anything I could identify, just everywhere. It was around 4:30 a.m., a foggy October morning. I could see the dim outline of the barn through the bedroom window. The fog rolled low across the pasture, thick enough to hide most of the fence line. Usually, the only sounds at this hour are the wind in the pines and the occasional cow calling out. But the hum had a vibration that seemed to reach through the floorboards and into my chest. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and grabbed my robe. My boots were already by the door from the night before, so I slipped them on and stepped outside. The cold bit at my face immediately. The fog hung heavy, wet on my eyelashes. My truck was parked near the barn, headlights off, and for a moment I just stood there, squinting across the pasture. That's when I noticed the cattle. Usually they're scattered across the field, munching or lying down, slow and lazy in the early morning. But now every single one of them was standing pressed close to the far fence, and they weren't facing me or the barn. They were all turned the same direction, heads down, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see yet. The hum made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked slowly toward the fence, boots sinking slightly into the wet grass. The fog made everything blurry, like I was looking through frosted glass. Then I saw it. A faint glow, hovering maybe 20 feet above the ground near the center of the pasture. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the whole field, but it threw just enough light to make the edges of the cattle shine in pale gold. I stopped. My heart was beating faster than usual, and for a moment I thought maybe it was a trick of the fog, a reflection off the barn or the damp grass. But the shape of the glow was too consistent. Round, almost like a lantern, but no wire, no flame, nothing I could explain. I took a step closer, then another. The hum didn't get louder. It just stayed there, pressing against me. I could feel it through the soles of my boots, through the metal of the fence I touched to steady myself. The cattle didn't move, not a single one, just standing, staring. I grabbed my flashlight from my belt and clicked it on, pointing toward the glow. The beam cut through the fog, and that's when it happened. The glow flickered once, like it blinked at me, then was gone. Just vanished. No movement, no sound, no trace left in the mist. I froze, trying to make sense of it. The fog hung heavy, the cattle were still pressed against the fence, and the hum had quieted just slightly, like it had noticed the glow was gone. I shone the flashlight across the field, but there was nothing. No object, no reflection, no smoke, nothing. I stood there for a long time, gripping the fence, trying to convince myself it was some kind of electrical transformer acting up. But there's no transformer near the pasture, and the cattle didn't act like they were reacting to noise or lights. They were fixed, silent, rigid in place. I finally let go of the fence and backed toward the house. My boots were wet, and the fog was thick enough that I had to step carefully over the grass to avoid tripping. When I reached the porch, I looked back one last time. The pasture was normal again. The cattle had scattered slowly, some lying down, others moving off toward the barn as if nothing had happened. The glow was gone. Even the hum was gone, leaving just the early morning silence and the fog drifting low over the grass. I didn't sleep again that morning. I stayed on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the field and trying to rationalize it. I thought maybe it was a reflection from a plane passing overhead, or a distant lantern from hunters in the next field. But nothing fit. The timing, the stillness of the cattle, the hum, it didn't line up with anything I knew. By the time sunrise broke through the fog, the field looked ordinary. The cattle grazed lazily. The barn cast a long shadow over the pasture. Everything was exactly how it should be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, just above the ground, watching, and then left without a trace. I went inside to check my phone. No messages, no alerts, nothing to indicate I'd somehow missed something obvious. Just me, the fog, and the memory of that hum, that pale glow hovering silently over my pasture, and a herd of cattle pressed to the fence in perfect, unnatural unison. I drove out to town later that morning, telling myself I'd laugh it off to a neighbor if anyone asked. But nobody did. And every time I look out over that field now, I can't help thinking about what was hovering there, just above the grass, and why the cows were all facing it. It was late September, and a few of us had gone up to Chippewa National Forest for a long weekend. There were 4 of us total: me, my friend Aaron, his cousin Matt, and a guy named Kyle. I only knew loosely through them. We weren't doing anything intense, just car camping at a primitive site a couple miles off the logging road. Nothing but a fire ring and a flat patch of ground for tents. The first night was normal. We cooked brats over the fire, had a few beers, and turned in around midnight. The temps had already started dropping that time of year, and once the fire burned down, you could really feel the cold sink in. The woods were dead quiet except for the occasional loon call echoing from the lake. I remember waking up sometime in the night to use the bathroom. I checked my phone and it was 2:43 a.m. I groaned, pulled on my boots, and unzipped the tent. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp enough that I could see my breath. The fire was long out, just a few faint embers glowing. I wandered to the edge of the trees to relieve myself, then went straight back into the tent. Nothing weird about it, just a typical chilly night in the forest. But about an hour later, I woke up again. I didn't know why at first, just that uneasy feeling where something pulls you out of a deep sleep. I lay there, staring up at the nylon ceiling of the tent, listening. The woods sounded different. Not silent exactly, but muted. No wind in the trees, no bugs, no distant loons, just this heavy stillness pressing in. Then I heard it, a whisper right outside the tent. My name. Eli. It was Aaron's voice, quiet like he was crouched just outside the flap. I propped myself up on one elbow, heart thumping. Aaron? I whispered back. No answer. The seconds dragged, the air in the tent feeling tight and stale. Then I heard it again. Same voice, same tone, even softer this time. Eli. I sat up fully, pulse hammering in my ears. Aaron's tent was 20 feet away on the other side of the fire ring. There was no reason for him to be at mine in the middle of the night. I swallowed, reached for the zipper, and slowly pulled it down. The sound of the teeth coming apart felt too loud in the silence. I pushed the flap open and stuck my head out. No one was there. The clearing looked washed out, pale. At first I thought it was the moonlight, but then I saw it, just over the treetops at the far end of the clearing. A glowing orb, maybe the size of a compact car drifting silently above the canopy. It wasn't blinding. The light was soft, almost milky, but it spread evenly across the clearing. My tent, the fire ring, even the trunks of the pines glowed faintly in it. Shadows stretched in odd directions, sharper than they should have been. I froze with my head sticking out, staring. The orb moved slowly, gliding laterally across the tree line. No sound, no flicker, no change in brightness, just smooth, deliberate movement. For a second, I thought maybe it really was the moon behind a cloud, but the shape was too defined, too close. And it wasn't above us. It was sliding horizontally, just above the trees. I ducked back inside the tent, zipped the flap, and sat there in the dark, trying to breathe quietly. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would wake the others. Then I realized something else. The whisper. Aaron calling my name. It hadn't come from across the clearing. It had come from right at the flap, inches away from where my head had been when I was sleeping. I don't know how long I sat there. It felt like forever, just staring at the tent wall, glowing faintly with that pale light. I wanted to call out to Aaron or Matt, but I couldn't bring myself to. My throat felt tight, like the sound wouldn't come out even if I tried. After what must have been 10, maybe 15 minutes, the glow outside dimmed. I risked opening the flap a crack. The orb had drifted higher, rising silently above the treetops until it was just another pale shape swallowed by the night sky. Then it was gone. I lay back down in my sleeping bag, wide awake until dawn. When the sun finally came up, the clearing looked ordinary again. Birds were back, chattering in the branches. Aaron was still asleep in his tent, and when I asked him later if he'd gotten up in the night, he swore he hadn't. No one else heard anything. No one else saw the light. I didn't bring it up again after that. But I never forgot standing there with the flap open, looking out at that silent clearing, pale light washing over everything, and knowing that something had whispered my name right outside the tent. I'd gone down to the river that morning earlier than I usually do. It was late October, the kind of cold where you could see your breath the moment you stepped outside, and the air carried that damp bite that sinks into your jacket no matter how many layers you put on. I parked my truck by the gravel pull-off around 5:15 a.m., just a little before sunrise. The fog was thick enough that my headlights felt useless, cutting only a few feet ahead, and when I shut the engine off, it was just silence. The stretch of river I fish is about a quarter-mile walk from the road, down a dirt path and through a strip of willows that crowd right up against the water. I know the trail well light, so I didn't bother with my flashlight at first. The fog muffled everything. The crunch of my boots, the rush of the current. It felt like I was walking inside a closed room, even though I was outdoors. When I reached the bank, I set my tackle box down on a flat rock and rigged my line by touch. The sky was still dark, though there was that faint hint of morning in the east, the kind of gray that promises the sun is somewhere behind all that cloud and mist. I cast my line out, heard the plop as it hit the water, and settled in. Usually I'd hear distant trucks on the highway or maybe the horn of a train cutting across the fields miles away, but that morning it was dead quiet. The fog had swallowed the world. That's when I noticed the lights. At first, I thought it was just a plane cutting across the sky, a single bright point through the fog. But after a few seconds, another appeared to the right of it, and then a third below them, forming a perfect triangle. They weren't blinking like aircraft lights. They weren't moving either. They just hovered there above the river, completely still, pale white with no halo, even in the fog. I stood there holding my rod, staring up. My first thought was maybe towers in the distance, except I'd fished this spot dozens of times, and I knew there weren't any towers near the river. Plus, towers don't appear and disappear in fog like that. A weird feeling crept over me. Not panic, just this deep wrongness, like my brain couldn't slot what I was seeing into anything familiar. I set my rod down on the bank without reeling in and reached for the flashlight in my tackle box. I don't even know why I pointed it at the lights. Instinct, I guess. I clicked it on and aimed the beam straight upward through the fog. The second the light touched them, all three vanished. Not faded, not drifted, gone. One instant they were there, steady as if pinned to the sky, and the next, nothing but mist above me. I kept the flashlight pointed up for a long time, my hand shaking a little. The fog swallowed the beam within a few feet, like shining into a wall of cotton. After a minute or two, I turned it off and just stood there, listening. The river gurgled and slapped against the rocks as if nothing had happened. But something felt different, heavier. I couldn't explain it. It was like the silence had gained weight. I packed up quicker than I ever had, cramming my gear back into the box without caring if it tangled. I half expected the lights to reappear, or worse, something else to step out of the fog on the bank. The walk back to the truck felt longer than usual. Every footstep seemed too loud, echoing against the mist. I glanced behind me more than once, even though I couldn't see more than a few yards. My gut kept telling me I wasn't alone out there. When I reached the gravel lot, the fog had thinned just enough to make out the shape of my truck. I threw the gear into the bed and got behind the wheel, locking the doors out of habit. I sat there for a while before starting the engine, just staring out through the windshield at the fog-soaked trees, waiting for another light to appear. But nothing else did. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, headlights carving tunnels through the mist. That whole drive, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, like I expected to see 3 pale lights hanging above the truck, following me down the road. I'd started jogging in the mornings that summer because the afternoons in Wisconsin were too hot and muggy. I lived on the edge of a small town, and my usual route circled past Lake Mendota. At that hour, there was rarely anyone around except maybe another runner or a fisherman down by the dock. This happened in early July, just after the 4th. I remember because there were still paper flags stuck in some of the front yards I passed on the way out. I left my apartment around 5:15 a.m. The sky was pale gray, not quite sunrise, and there was a thin fog rolling low across the ground. My breath didn't cloud. It was warm enough already, but the air felt heavy with dew. I usually ran with earbuds in, but that day I forgot them. The quiet was sharp, just my shoes on the pavement and the distant hum of insects waking up. By the time I reached the trail that cut around the lake, the fog was thicker. The water itself was still, glassy, reflecting the lightening sky. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just the last of the stars fading, but they were too low. A cluster of faint lights, maybe 6 or 7 of them, hovering over the water. Not bright, just enough to stand out against the fog. I slowed to a jog walk, wiping sweat from my forehead, squinting through the haze. They didn't blink like plane lights. They were steady. And they weren't moving much, just a slow, subtle drift, like they were tethered above the lake. I told myself maybe it was drones, someone flying them early. But there was no sound, no buzzing, no whirring. The water carried sound easily, and it was dead quiet. I stopped completely when the lights shifted. One by one, they slid into place, forming a perfect straight line over the lake. No wobble, no uneven spacing, just a clean row, glowing faint in the morning haze. I counted again, 7 of them. My chest tightened. I didn't know why it scared me so much, but something about the precision of it felt unnatural, like it was too deliberate. I backed a few steps down the trail, eyes locked on the lights. That's when they moved again. The line broke apart all at once. The lights scattered in different directions, fast, too fast to be drones, too fast to be anything I'd ever seen in the sky. They shot out like sparks from a fire, zigzagging at angles no plane could make. Some darted straight up, others sideways, vanishing into the fog until I couldn't track them anymore. I just stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something. But the sky above the lake was empty again. After a minute or two, I started jogging again, slower this time, glancing back every few steps. The water stayed flat and gray, the fog rolling low, nothing unusual left behind. But as I rounded the next bend, I noticed the birds. Usually around dawn, the gulls and geese would be loud, squawking and diving. That morning, it was silent. Not a single wing over the water. The trees along the shoreline were still too. No rustling, just me, my footsteps, and the sound of my own breath. I cut my run short and headed back the way I came, hugging the road instead of the trail. My shirt was sticking to my back, though I hadn't gone far enough to be drenched in sweat. Every shadow between the houses looked darker than it should. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me, even though it was barely 6 in the morning and the sun had started to rise. I poured a glass of water and sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window, half expecting to see those lights hanging above the parking lot. I didn't run by the lake again for weeks. When I finally went back, the mornings felt normal again. Birds loud, fishermen out early, joggers passing with earbuds in. But every time I reached the spot where I'd seen them, I slowed down without meaning to, scanning the horizon. The lake looked the same as it always had, but I couldn't shake the image of those lights, perfectly lined up over the water before scattering like sparks into the fog. I woke up to my dog going crazy. Bo is a shepherd mix, not the type to bark without reason. It wasn't the half-hearted woof he'd make if a raccoon was near the barn either. This was deep, furious, non-stop. I sat up and glanced at the clock on my nightstand. It was 2:43 in the morning. At first, I figured it was coyotes. They cut across my land sometimes, and Bo hated them. But then I noticed something different about the sound of his barking. It wasn't directed at the woods or the fence line like usual. He was facing the cornfield. I pulled on my jeans and boots, grabbed the flashlight by the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was warm for late August, and the air smelled damp from the storm that had rolled through earlier. Clouds had mostly cleared, but there was still a haze over the fields. That's when I saw the light. It was maybe 200 yards out, low over the corn, bright white like a floodlight, but moving. At first I thought maybe one of the neighbors had a truck out there, but no engine sound carried across. The light glided slow, steady, just above the tops of the stalks. Bo was practically losing his mind, straining against his chain, barking so hard his front paws left the ground. I called his name, but he didn't even flick an ear. I held the flashlight tight and started down the porch steps. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Check for trespassers, maybe. But the closer I got, the stranger it looked. The light wasn't swinging like from a hand or bouncing like a headlamp. It was locked in place, smooth as glass, drifting across the rows. I got about 30 yards from the porch when it stopped, just hung there above the corn. It felt like the whole night leaned toward it. Even Bo's barking broke off, mid-growl. The silence hit so hard I noticed my own breathing. I raised my flashlight instinctively and clicked it on, shining straight at the thing. That's when it moved. Not forward, not sideways. Straight up. It shot into the sky like it had been pulled by a string. No build-up, no acceleration, just gone. I craned my neck, but it disappeared so fast I couldn't even track it. No fading, no dimming, it was just gone. I stood in the field with my light shaking in my hand, pointing at nothing. Bo whined low, the first sound since it vanished, like he was unsure if it was safe to make noise again. I walked to the edge of the corn, but stopped short of stepping in. The rows were still wet from the storm, and the smell of wet stalks was heavy. I kept my flashlight steady on the tops, half expecting to see something. Broken stalks, movement. But there was nothing. No sound of insects, no rustling. The entire field was still. I stayed out there longer than I should have, just listening, scanning. Eventually, I forced myself back to the porch. Bo stayed pressed against my leg, ears pinned back, his body rigid. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I walked the field. I checked the rows where I thought the light had hovered. Nothing looked trampled, nothing broken. The soil was soft from the rain, and I saw my own boot prints where I'd stopped at the edge, but nothing else. All day I kept thinking maybe it was a drone. Kids around here fly them sometimes, though never at night, not in the middle of someone's cornfield. And none of the drones I'd seen could move like that, straight up, clean out of sight in a blink. That night I made coffee and sat on the porch past midnight, watching. The air felt heavy again, humid and thick. Bo lay at my feet, quiet but alert. Around 1 a.m, he sat up fast, ears pointed toward the field. I didn't see anything, but I noticed it was quiet again. Crickets had been chirping steady all night, frogs croaking by the pond, but in that moment, everything dropped out. The silence rolled across the property like a wave. Bo growled low in his throat, but no light showed. I kept staring until my eyes burned, flashlight ready in my hand, but nothing happened. After maybe 10 minutes, the night noises came back, almost like someone had flipped a switch. A few nights later, it happened again. This time I was already awake, reading in the kitchen. Bo launched off his bed, barking toward the back door. I grabbed the flashlight, heart pounding, and opened it. The light was back. Same white brightness, same height above the corn, drifting slow. I froze in the doorway. My instinct was to run out, but something in me held back. I watched instead, breathing through my teeth. The light paused again, almost exactly where it had the first time. Then it slid sideways, smooth and silent, before halting again. Bo barked and barked until I called him back. He wouldn't come inside, though. He just paced in circles by the porch, growling. The light drifted to the far end of the field and stopped once more. For a second I thought it was going to shoot upward again, but instead it dimmed. Not fast, just faded down like a bulb burning out. After maybe 10 seconds, it was gone. No sound, no trace. I didn't sleep that night either. I never told anyone. Not my neighbor Carl, not even my sister when she called that weekend. I didn't want to hear the explanations, the dismissals. I just kept it to myself, walking the fields every morning, scanning the sky every night. A few times since then, Bo has gone off in the middle of the night, but when I check, I don't see anything. Sometimes the silence rolls in, the kind of silence that makes your ears feel plugged, but no light follows. Still, I keep the flashlight by the door, and I've gotten into the habit of checking the corn from the porch before bed, just in case. It was close to midnight when my girlfriend and I started walking back from her friend Rachel's place. She lived maybe a mile from my apartment, and we figured the walk would be fine since the air was cool for once. Early September, light breeze, clear sky. The neighborhood was quiet, just rows of small houses with trimmed hedges, a couple of streetlights, and the occasional dog barking in the distance. We cut down Sycamore Street, which was always darker than the others because the trees blocked the street lamps. That's when we first heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. A low hum, not mechanical like an air conditioner, not sharp like a power line buzz. It was deeper, more even, almost like the sound you feel in your chest when you stand near a big generator, except it was softer, stretched out, coming from above. Do you hear that? Amanda stopped walking and tilted her head back. I heard it too, though I didn't want to admit it at first. I thought maybe it was my ears ringing, but when she asked, it confirmed it wasn't just me. We both looked up. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The sky was full of stars, bright ones too, since the air was so clear. But right above us, there was this patch where nothing showed. Not clouds, not tree branches, just an absence. As my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't empty. It was a shape, a triangle, perfectly straight edges, each side sharp against the night sky, blotting out the stars behind it. The thing wasn't lit, no running lights like a plane, no glow at all. If it weren't for the stars being gone where it passed, I might not have seen it. Amanda grabbed my arm. What is that? The hum grew clearer as it moved. It was gliding, slow, right above the treetops. Not wobbling, not shifting, just steady. It had to be massive. The width of it covered almost the entire street from our perspective, stretching over rooftops on both sides. We both stood frozen. I remember the hairs on my arms standing up, and not because of the breeze. It felt wrong, like something that size shouldn't be able to float silently like that. I whispered, "It's blocking everything." Amanda just held tighter to my arm. The triangle crept along the street, so slow it felt deliberate. I expected at any second to hear jets, to see flashing lights, anything that made sense. Instead, the only sound was that steady, low hum that seemed to vibrate in my ribcage. We started walking again without really deciding to, keeping pace with it. Every step, it stayed above us, moving in the same direction we were going. We weren't under the middle of it anymore, more like under one of the edges, but it still covered half the visible sky. At the next corner, Amanda tugged me toward the light of a street lamp, like being under something familiar would help. But the lamp buzzed and flickered as soon as we got near it, dimming like a dying bulb. She let out this nervous laugh, but I could hear the edge in it. We crossed to the other side of the street. That's when we both noticed how quiet everything was. No cars, no dogs barking anymore, no insects. The whole neighborhood felt drained of sound except for that hum. I tried to rationalize it. Military testing, maybe. Some weird stealth plane. But I couldn't line up how silent it was. It's how close it felt, how you couldn't see anything except the void it cut in the stars. We reached another block and stopped again. The triangle kept moving, not fast, not slow, but steady. It turned, not like a plane banking, just rotating. Effortless. No tilt, no change in altitude, just a clean pivot. And now it was headed diagonally across the neighborhood toward the open fields past Lincoln Avenue. We watched it drift, the edges still sharp, the hum fading slightly as it moved away. After a while, the stars started reappearing behind it. One by one, they blinked back into place as though nothing had been there at all. Amanda whispered, "It's gone," but I kept staring. The silence hung for another few seconds before the night filled back in. The chirp of crickets, a dog barking 3 streets over, the distant rumble of a car. It was almost too normal, like the world had been paused and someone had hit play again. We didn't talk the rest of the way to my apartment. Amanda held my hand so tightly, my fingers went numb, but neither of us let go. When we finally got inside, I locked the door out of instinct, even though I knew whatever that was wouldn't be stopped by a lock. Later, lying in bed, I kept thinking about how clear the edges had been. That black triangle blotting out the stars, moving without sound. I kept waiting to hear the hum again, but the only thing I could hear was the ringing in my ears and Amanda breathing beside me, wide awake, neither of us saying a word. It happened when I was 16, the summer before my junior year. I grew up in a suburb outside of Toledo, nothing fancy, just rows of split-level houses and sidewalks that always seemed cracked from tree roots. Most nights I stayed up too late, walking around the block with my headphones in, trying to clear my head. This night was like that. Humid, quiet, maybe around 11. I had been sitting on the curb in front of our house, scrolling on my phone, when I noticed the streetlight above me dim and flicker. At first I figured it was just old wiring. It did that sometimes. But then in the corner of my eye, I saw the light down the street do the same thing. And then the one after that. I took out my earbuds and just sat there watching. Every single streetlight on our block pulsed at the exact same moment, like they were all hooked to one giant switch. It wasn't random flickering either. It was in sync, dimming and brightening in a rhythm that lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then they went steady again. I remember standing up, my phone still in my hand, and turning in a slow circle. The neighborhood was quiet, but it suddenly felt too quiet. No cars, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. That's when I looked up. At first I thought it was just a cloud drifting across the stars, but then I realized how sharp the edges looked. It was a shape, a solid shape, moving slow enough that I could track it without shifting my eyes. It was enormous. I couldn't make out any detail, no lights on it, no texture, just blackness, darker than the sky itself, blotting out the stars in a huge, perfect line. I froze right there on the curb, staring up with my mouth open. It stretched across half the block, silent, like a piece of night peeling away and sliding above us. I kept waiting for some kind of sound. A plane. Even a blimp makes noise. Something, but there was nothing. Not even the faint rush of air. I felt this weird pressure in my chest, like the air was thicker, heavier. My skin prickled, goosebumps crawling up my arms even though it was muggy out. Then the streetlights flickered again. All of them. Perfectly timed. And in that instant, I swear the shape paused, just for a heartbeat, like it noticed. I ducked instinctively, crouching low even though there was no reason to. My phone slipped out of my hand and clattered on the sidewalk, but I didn't move to grab it. I just crouched there, eyes locked on the sky. The shape kept gliding forward, covering more of the block. From where I was, it looked like it stretched from one row of houses to the other. I couldn't tell how high it was. It could have been barely above the rooftops or way higher. The lack of sound made it impossible to judge. I thought about running inside, but the idea of moving felt wrong. Like if I drew attention to myself, something would happen. So I stayed crouched there, every muscle tight, my hands pressed into the warm concrete. When it finally reached the end of the street, the stars came back into view, one by one, like someone lifting a sheet off the sky. The streetlights flickered again, 3 quick pulses, then steady, and just like that, it was gone. I didn't move for a long time. I don't know how long exactly, but enough that the sweat on the back of my neck cooled. When I finally stood, my knees popped like I'd been crouched for an hour. My phone was still lying on the sidewalk, the screen cracked from the fall. I picked it up and turned in a slow circle, looking at every house, every shadow, half expecting someone else to have seen it. But the windows were all dark. Nobody had come out. No one else was awake. When I went back inside, my mom was asleep on the couch with the TV on low. I almost woke her up, but the words felt stuck in my throat. What was I even supposed to say? I ended up sitting in my room with the lights off, staring out the window at the streetlight, waiting for it to flicker again. It didn't. The block looked normal. The stars looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something massive had passed directly over my neighborhood, and nobody but me had noticed. I was driving west on Highway 62, cutting through the Mojave, heading back toward 29 Palms after visiting a friend in Parker. It was late summer, hot even with the sun going down, and I had the windows cracked because the air conditioner in my truck barely worked. The desert has this strange way of holding on to heat, like the ground itself radiates it back at you long after the sun dips. Around the time I hit the stretch past Rice, I noticed something in the side mirror. At first, I thought it was just a bright star, maybe Venus, because it was low on the horizon and looked steady. But as I kept glancing, I realized it didn't move the way it should. Every curve, every straightaway, the thing stayed in the same position relative to my truck. Always just over my left shoulder, glowing steady, almost white. I tried not to obsess over it. I turned up the radio, kept my eyes on the road, told myself it was just my brain locking onto a bright planet while I was driving long distance. But every time I checked the mirror, it was still there. The weird part was that nothing else was in the sky. The dusk had this pale, flat light. No stars yet, just a faint orange line where the sun had been. Everything else was washed out blue. This one point of light looked out of place, like it had no business being there. After about 20 miles, I started testing it. I slowed down, sped up, even swerved slightly within my lane. the light didn't change. I'd crest a hill and dip into a low stretch, and I'd still see it, same spot, steady as if it was tethered to me. That's when I decided to pull over. There's not much out there but gravel shoulders and creosote bushes. I eased the truck off the road, gravel crunching under my tires, and threw it into park. My first thought was maybe it would slide past, like it had been coincidentally aligned all that time. But when I stepped out and shut the door, the desert was silent and the light was still there. It hadn't moved an inch. I leaned against the side of the truck, staring up. The heat coming off the asphalt made the air shimmer, but the light cut right through it. White, steady, sharp, too steady. I cupped a hand over my eyes like that would help and tried to gauge if it was closer than a star should be. I couldn't tell. There were no clouds, no frame of reference, just open desert. But something about it felt near, like I could sense the distance shrinking if I focused too hard. The longer I stood there, the quieter it felt. Normally you'd hear at least a cricket or two, maybe the faint hiss of the wind through the brush. But there was nothing. Just the ticking sound of my truck cooling down and my own breathing. After maybe a minute, I got this sudden urge to get back in the truck. I can't explain it better than that. Like standing out there under that light was wrong. So I climbed back inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. The second I pulled back onto the highway, I checked the mirror again. Still there, perfectly in line with me, like it had been waiting. I drove faster, trying to put distance between myself and the feeling of being watched. I didn't look at the mirror for a while, but every time I finally glanced, it was there, holding its place. About 10 miles later, I saw another car coming toward me, a pair of headlights cresting a hill. As it passed, I glanced back at the mirror. For the first time, the light seemed to shift. Not much, just a tiny flicker like it had been disturbed. When the other car's taillights disappeared in the distance, it snapped right back into its spot. That was the point where my stomach really dropped. I pulled over again, more abrupt this time, gravel spraying. I shut off the headlights, killed the engine, and just sat there in the dark. The desert swallowed the sound quick, like it always does out there. The light hovered, steady, same as before. I rolled the window down and stuck my head out, craning my neck to look up at the glass between us. Still the same. No sound, no movement, no flicker. I don't know how long I sat there. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Long enough for the sky to darken more, long enough for other stars to finally start showing. That's what unsettled me even more. As the stars appeared one by one, they all twinkled faintly, shifting with the atmosphere, except for that one. It didn't change at all. Eventually, I turned the key again, headlights washing over the brush, and pulled back onto the road. I didn't even want to look at the mirror anymore, but I couldn't stop myself. Each time I did, it was waiting, locked in place. By the time I hit the outskirts of 29 Palms, the town lights started to bleed into the sky. Street lamps, gas stations, neon signs, it all glowed hazy against the dark. I checked the mirror one last time, and the light was gone. Not faded, not drifted away, just gone. I pulled into my driveway shaking, headlights bouncing off my garage door. When I stepped out, I scanned the sky again, searching for it. All I saw were regular stars, scattered like they should be, all of them blinking faintly in the desert haze. Boiling kettle in my head or not, I know what I saw out there. A light that shouldn't have been there. A light that moved when I moved. And a silence in the desert that felt too deep to be natural. I was driving back from a late shift at the hospital, just me and the highway stretching through eastern Nebraska. It was past midnight, maybe 12:30, and the air had that sharp, cold bite that comes after a frost. My windshield had tiny ice crystals along the edges, the wipers scraping the last of the fog away as I passed the cornfields. My name's Lisa, 28, and I usually stick to city streets at night, but tonight I decided to cut across the county roads to save time. Big mistake, in hindsight. The first thing that felt off was the radio. I had it turned off, right? Yet a faint static hiss filled the cab. Not music, not a station breaking through, just that high-pitched, shivering hiss that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I reached over, flipped the knob to make sure the unit was off. It was. Still, the static continued, just barely audible, like it was coming from outside the car. I pulled over to the shoulder, my heart thumping, thinking maybe it was interference from power lines or a loose connection in the wiring. But even after I cut the engine and the static didn't fade, it felt deliberate. I shook it off, told myself it was nothing, and eased back onto the road. The fields stretched flat on either side, black under the pale frost, the only light from the distant moon and my headlights. A couple of farmhouses dotted the horizon, all dark and quiet. The static came and went in waves, sometimes louder, sometimes barely there, but always in the background, persistent. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer. A light in the middle of the road, hovering maybe 2 feet above the asphalt. Not a headlamp, not a reflection, just a glowing orb. Pale, bluish-white, with a soft halo like it was suspended in a bubble of air. The headlights shouldn't have illuminated it from that angle, yet it didn't cast a shadow, didn't roll or flicker. It just hung there, silent about 30 yards ahead. I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The thing didn't move the way a deer would. It didn't dart, it didn't bolt. It drifted slowly across the road, perpendicular to my car, with no sound, no air movement, nothing to suggest motion at all. I was frozen for a second, staring, pulse hammering in my ears. My car engine, idling under the weight of my panic, sounded absurdly loud. I thought, okay, I need to get a better look, so I grabbed my phone to record it. I've got a cheap stabilizer mount in the glove box. As soon as I moved, the static in the radio spiked, almost like a wave crashing in my head. It wasn't loud, but it was overwhelming. My hands shook, the phone nearly slipping out of my fingers. I turned back to the road. Gone. Just empty asphalt, frost glittering in the headlights like nothing had been there. I blinked, thinking maybe my brain had played a trick, but the static was still there, low and persistent, now seeming to pulse with each heartbeat. I tapped the dashboard, yanked on the knob again, off, and still it hummed faintly. I swear I could feel it vibrating through the steering wheel, not the radio. I eased forward slowly, careful now. The road curved gently to the left, and as I rounded it, I saw a second light further down. Smaller, less defined, moving in the same quiet, deliberate drift across the fields just off the road. I stopped the car completely this time, engine idling, just watching. The light paused as if it noticed me, then lifted slightly off the ground and zipped back behind a line of trees. No sound, no motion in the air, just gone. I considered calling the police, reporting something strange on the road. My voice caught in my throat when I picked up my phone. The battery read 12%, but when I tried to make a call, it said no signal. Even the GPS had frozen, my location pin stuck in the middle of the highway with a small circle that wouldn't move. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to rationalize. Could it have been a drone? A flare? A low-flying light from some farm equipment? None of it fit. No trail, no hum, no motion like I'd expect. And the static, how could a drone produce static through a dead radio? I finally started moving again, cautiously. As soon as I reached the point where the first orb had been, I realized the air felt different. Not colder, not windier, just heavier, like there was tension I could almost press my hand into. The radio static flared briefly, and I swear I could see a faint shimmer in the air off the left shoulder, like heat waves on pavement, but bluish. Then, gone. About a mile down, I saw another flash in the trees, pale, quick, almost like the orb had blinked out. I slowed, thinking I might be hallucinating, but the frost on the road reflected it for a moment, like a ripple across the blacktop. No noise, not a rustle, nothing moved except the shimmer. I kept driving, heart still racing, eyes scanning every tree line, ditch, and field edge. Every so often, the static would flare up, a soft, pulsing hiss that seemed synchronized with the faint glow ahead of me, then fade. No pattern, no predictability, just there. By the time I reached the next town, about 10 miles down the road, the lights were gone. The static vanished too. The radio worked normally, GPS updated, phones picked up signal. I sat at a stoplight, engine idling, hands gripping the wheel, wondering if I should just go home and pretend it hadn't happened. I drove the remaining 40 minutes to my apartment in Lincoln in silence. Roads empty, streetlights flicking above. I kept checking the mirrors, the sky, even though it didn't make sense. Nothing. Just the occasional car far behind, mundane and predictable. I got inside, locked the door, left my keys on the counter, and sat on the couch staring out at the night sky through the window. Frost had settled over the rooftops, the stars bright and pinprick clear, And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, moving in ways I couldn't understand, just beyond my reach. I haven't told anyone in detail. People would say I imagined it. I wish I could explain the static, the precise drift, the complete silence, and I wish I knew what I saw, but all I have is memory, lingering, uneasy, and the thought that maybe it's still out there somewhere, waiting along a road where the lights are faint and the radio hums just a little. I was alone on the skiff because I liked the quiet that comes after dark. Out past the breakwater, the harbor light looked small, and the town behind it was just a soft smear of sodium lamps. I'd left the dock around 10, baited a few lines, and let the boat drift where the current wanted it. It was late August, warm without the day's stickiness, and the sky was the kind that felt like someone had stretched velvet over the world. Stars were sharp as pins. My name's Jonah Mercer. I fish for stripers mostly, part-time, and I know that stretch of water like the back of my hand. That night, everything felt normal at first. The lick of a small wake against the hull, the smell of salt and old bait, the lullaby of a harbor buoy clicking somewhere back toward the shore. Every so often, a fish would slap the surface and the ripples would feather out in the dark. Then the noise fell away. It happened so gradually I almost missed it. 1 second there was the usual background of distant engines and a gull calling to someone on shore. The next, those sounds were gone, cut clean off like someone had put the world on mute. The gull's cry stopped mid-echo and didn't resume. The harbor buoy kept clicking, but it seemed farther, as if sound had been stretched thin and pulled away from me. That made my neck prick. I turned the radio dial by habit, more for company than anything. Static filled the speaker for a second, then a single low tone like a note from a cello hummed under the hiss. No voices, no stations. I thumbed the power off and the hiss stayed, faint, as if the static had moved into the air itself. I had to lean over the side to remind myself the water was there because the surface looked unnaturally flat, like black glass. I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the horizon. Nothing. No lights, no other boats, just the black curve of the distant tree line and the scattered spots of town behind it. Even the usual sky traffic seemed thin. I told myself I was being dramatic, the radio's oddness, the silence. It was probably a squall somewhere packing the sound down. I'd been up early that morning, had a long day, cadence of the brain getting jumpy. I told myself to settle in. So I did. I checked the lines, adjusted the drift, and sat back against the outboard cover. My watch read 10:05. I could feel the salt cool on the back of my neck. Then a streak cut across the sky, like someone had thrown a bright cigarette from some high place and it caught as it fell. At first it behaved like a meteor, fast, white, and impossibly bright against the dark. It left that long white tail I'd seen a dozen times in summers. I pointed the binoculars without thinking. The streak was coming down toward the water somewhere off my starboard bow, and a thrill ran through me. Shooting stars were good luck, old fisher superstitions, cheap things to believe in, to pass the night. But then it did something I had never seen before. The streak stopped, not slowed, not burned out. It halted mid-fall and hung in the sky like someone had hit pause. It was maybe 30 degrees above the horizon by my guess, a handful of degrees to my right. Through the binoculars, it was a compact pin of white, steady and intense. No tail, no fanning dust, just a shard of light holding its place. My first reaction was that I was seeing after images, some fatigue of the eye. I blinked hard, the light stayed. I tightened my grip on the glass and watched it. There was no sound from it, no crack, no sizzle of air. The only thing that registered was the way the light seemed to be waiting, like it had been aiming for someplace and paused to check the coordinates. I turned the outboard off then, letting the skiff drift with nothing but current. The silence felt thicker. The radio static flared and then dropped to that low cello note again. I reached for my phone in my dry bag, no bars as usual out there, and angled it to film. The screen showed a black horizon and dots for distant lights, and in the upper right, a bright white pixel that matched the light with ridiculous clarity. I filmed for maybe 10 seconds and kept the binoculars at my eyes. Without warning, it moved. Not down now, but in a quick, jerking zig, like someone dragging the cursor of a video and snapping it at odd angles. Right, left, down a hair, a sharp up. Each change was violent enough to send a small flinch through me, but there was no sound and no wake on the water where it seemed to pass. The motion was unnatural, angular, with no curve like a bird or aircraft would make. It darted in a pattern that didn't feel random. Short, straight shots, small pauses, then another bite of speed. The light's path kept it within sight for a long time because it wasn't falling anymore. It was pacing a little, zigging around as if trying to map something in the dark sea below. At one point it dipped lower, closer to the water, and I felt that old animal reflex where the world narrows and your hands want to move. I leaned forward, heart thudding, and the light slowed, hovered as if deciding, then snapped upward in a clean line. It hung, perfectly still, for maybe 5 beats of my heart. Being that close and that bright, it made the scuppers on the boat glitter white for the fraction of a second. I could see detail through the binoculars, if detail is the right word for a clean white point. There was no edge, no glow, just density of light. My brain tried to make sense of it like it would a headlight or a flare, but it read wrong. It didn't flare or fade. It held. Then, in a motion so quick I almost missed the start, it shot off. Not a slingshot curve or a ballistic arc, just a flat, impossible acceleration straight across the sky until it was gone, a smudge, and then nothing. No contrail, no residual streak. The spot where it had been one heartbeat was simply empty. When it vanished, the sounds crept back in like water flooding a dry room. A distant motor hummed, someone laughed across the harbor, a gull started up and circled lazily searching for an easier perch. The radio static cut out like a switch. My phone showed the recording I'd taken, and in the last frames, the light's abrupt departure looked like a camera glitch. 1 second on, the next black sky. But I had felt it, the angular moves, the pause, the impossible sprint. That feeling hadn't left. I sat for a long time after, until the salt dried in stiff lines on my hands and my legs started to ache from the cramped position. I ran through explanations: satellite re-entry, improbable debris, a military training flare. I tested each against what I'd watched, and they didn't fit. The zigzags were wrong for anything under normal flight control, wrong for anything subject to gravity in the way a meteor is. There was no sound, no heat signature I could perceive, just a white precision in motion. When I finally started the motor and headed back to the harbor, the town seemed softer somehow, muffled by distance. People on the shore were wrapped in blankets, pointing up at me like I'd been looking at the sky too. But their faces had that small, skeptical smile people wear when a bonfire story gets to the punchline. At the dock, the light of the fish house was on and a few men were unloading a late catch. I tied up, sliding the painter over the post, and my hands were steady enough this time to work. I told them what I'd seen. There are fishermen who trade in stories like weather. They measure truth in whether the story costs them business or gains them mates. I could hear the normal lines, probably a plane, satellites, you get tired out there, and some furrowed brows, some short, practiced skepticism. Old Pete, who'd launched boats when I was a kid, just scratched his chin and said, "You ever see one again, tell me?" I didn't sleep much that night. I cleaned gear until my fingers hurt because action makes the head stop leaning toward the thing it doesn't know. I rode my bike home as dawn smeared pale on the horizon, and the sky was ordinary and blue, gulls at the harbor squawking like they'd never stopped. The recording on my phone looped that bright pixel and then the dark. It was ambiguous and fragile, which made it more dangerous. Over the next few days, I kept checking the forecast, scanning the sky, looking for anything angular and patient. Folks I told smiled and stepped around it like a curb. I'd catch myself scanning the waterline at night, expecting the same cold pause of silence, but it never came back. The harbor sounded normal now. The buoy clicked in predictable rhythm. The memory of the way that light hauled itself sideways and then split the darkness with impossible speed is still there in my chest, an itch that won't settle. I went back out a couple times after, salt in the nostrils, lines in the water. The ocean is good at forgiving you, and it keeps its own counsel. I anchored and stared where it had been and tried to look like I was doing it for the fish. The more I tried to pin the night down, the more slippery it became. One precise white point, how it hung, how it jerked, and then how it left in a single clean motion. I was home by dawn each time, and by then, the world had rearranged itself into routine. Coffee, the count of bait in the box, the small talk in the harbor. What I know is what I saw and how my skin tightened when it did those faceted turns. I know the silence that fell before it and the way ordinary sound reopened afterward. I know I came home alive, tied the boat and went inside, and that the town's morning business rolled right on as if night hadn't been interrupted. I don't have an explanation, only the memory of a star that stopped mid-fall, arranged itself like some small careful machine, and then left as if it had better places to be. I was cruising over the flat plains outside Amarillo that night, flying my little Piper Cherokee single engine, just me and the hum of the Lycoming under the nose. The sky was clear, cold, and enormous, and the city lights were nothing but a thin smear on the horizon. I had taken off late, around 10:30 p.m., hoping for a quiet flight before heading home to Lubbock. My name's Darren, 35, been flying small planes for over a decade. I've done the usual night cross-country stuff, instrument practice, ferry flights, never anything like this. I was just leveling at 6,500 feet, the autopilot holding me steady, when I noticed the first light. At first, I thought it was a star. No, not a star, it moved. Not much, just shifting slightly as if pacing me. I scanned my cockpit, checked instruments, no traffic blip on ADS-B, nothing on the radar. I turned my head fully out the side window and saw 2 more lights appear, forming a rough triangle behind my left wing. They were bright white, almost too intense to look at directly, but not glaring. I flicked my landing lights on and off, thinking maybe some reflection or a nearby aircraft. Nothing. No other planes reported by ATC, no blips, no replies. I called them on the radio, gave them my position, and asked if there was any traffic in the area. The controller sounded confused. Darren, we're showing you alone, no traffic anywhere near your altitude. Confirm your position. I did. Double-checked the coordinates on my GPS. Still nothing. The lights started moving in sync with me, staying just off my left wing. I tried a slow turn to the right, watching them adjust their positions in real time. The 3 of them maintained perfect spacing, pacing me like they were following a rule I couldn't see. My stomach nodded. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was tense, aware that I was an unarmed, tiny craft in a sky full of possibilities. I toggled my cockpit lights, then turned them off to get a better view. The lights seemed sharper, more solid. They didn't blink like navigation lights, no anti-collision strobes, nothing conventional. They had a clean, almost clinical brightness, and they just followed. At one point I tried climbing, then descending, and the same. They adjusted to my speed and vector. I estimated maybe 30-50 feet away horizontally, not miles. Close enough that if anything went wrong, I'd notice instantly. I checked my instruments obsessively. Altimeter steady, airspeed normal, no turbulence other than my own wake. And still, the triangle just paced me. I called ATC again, voice slightly shaky now. I'm seeing 3 objects off the left wing moving with me. Can you confirm any traffic? No, Darren, still showing nothing. You're alone. I muttered. Yeah, thanks. There was a pause in the airwaves, nothing unusual except my own breathing echoing in the headset. I considered turning back toward Amarillo, descending to see if I could get visual on the objects from below, but I hesitated. They were keeping distance, but perfectly coordinated, and the thought of doing anything that might surprise them, I don't know, it just felt reckless. The hum of the engine started to feel louder in my ears, or maybe I was noticing it because my senses were stretched thin. I glanced over at the left wing and caught a flicker of movement. One of the lights seemed to accelerate briefly, then return to position. Smooth, precise, too fast for any small conventional aircraft I knew of. I considered switching on my transponder to squawk a different code, thinking maybe I could force them onto ATC radar somehow. As soon as I did, the lights blinked once, perfectly synchronized, and then they split slightly, forming a wider triangle but still moving with me. My pulse jumped. My mind was trying to rationalize. Maybe another pilot messing with me, maybe a rare atmospheric effect, maybe something else entirely. I radioed ATC one more time. This is Darren, aircraft 6598, lights still with me. They're pacing me, 3 total, bright off the left wing. Darren, we're still showing nothing, no other traffic. Can you see any shapes? Just lights? Just lights. No shapes, no sound, just them moving like they're aware of me. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear faint typing, then the controller said, "Maintain your course and altitude. If anything changes, report immediately." I didn't argue. I climbed slightly to 7,000 feet to see if they would follow. And they did. The moment I leveled, they stayed in formation, adjusting with precision. My stomach was tight. I couldn't see wings, fuselages, nothing tangible. Just perfect points of bright white light. I tried toggling the landing lights, flashing the strobes on and off, even waggling my plane gently. They mirrored it. I decided I'd had enough. I headed back toward Amarillo, keeping the plane steady, trying to stay calm. I watched the triangle the whole way, expecting them to vanish, but they didn't. I got to about 5,500 feet, thinking maybe descending into haze would obscure them. As soon as I did, they climbed to match me, staying in formation. Somewhere over open farmland, I finally toggled off the avionics I didn't need and took a deep breath. "Okay, Darren, you're in this sky alone," I muttered, trying to reassure myself. I hadn't seen anything like it before. Not drones, not aircraft, nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, they began to drift back, slowly at first. I wasn't accelerating or changing vector, just holding a straight line. The lights began to pull back, widening the gap between us until I glanced over and they were gone. No streaks, no contrails, no sudden flashes, just the night sky empty again, perfectly normal. I radioed ATC, voice stilled tight. "They're gone." "Copy that, Darren. All quiet on radar." I flew the remaining 30 minutes back to Lubbock in silence. My hands stayed on the yoke, white-knuckled for reasons I couldn't fully name. I was alone, or at least the instruments said I was. The lights, that perfect pacing, the smooth precision of their movements, they stuck in my head. When I landed, I taxied in slowly, telling myself it had to have been something. Reflections, rare atmospheric optics, maybe an optical illusion at the edge of night vision. But the way they moved, exactly in sync with me, responded to changes in my altitude, my speed, my maneuvers. It didn't fit anything I knew. I parked the plane, climbed out, and stood on the tarmac under the dim apron lights. The wind had picked up slightly, stirring the cold night. I looked up at the stars, empty and familiar, but I couldn't shake the sense that whatever had been out there had been aware of me. I walked back to the little FBO office, half hoping someone else had seen it, half hoping they hadn't. Inside, the office was quiet, fluorescent lights humming. The attendant looked up at me and smiled. "Late night?" "Yeah," I said, voice flat, mind still half in the air. "Very late." I drove home in the dark, streets nearly empty. The sky was just sky, the wind brushing through the trees. At home, I made coffee, checked my plane one last time, and sat on the porch, staring up. Nothing moved. No lights, no hum, just the distant city glow. I still don't know what I saw. I can't explain the way it moved, the precision, the awareness. And part of me doesn't want to. I woke to a light in the room and thought I'd left a lamp on. For a second I didn't move, just lay there with my head on the pillow, eyes half closed because the glow was soft and steady, not the harsh kind that makes you squint. When I opened my eyes properly, the whole bedroom had that washed-out look like a photograph someone had overexposed. Clothes on the chair looked like pale ghosts. The hardwood floor reflected a faint, even sheen. No lamps were on. No TV. The little digital clock on the nightstand, usually an angry red, was dark. My name's Daniel. I live alone in a 2-story house on the edge of a small subdivision where the road gives out into a woodlot. That was where the light seemed to be coming from, somewhere past the fence and the first row of oak trees. I sat up and my spine clicked. It was maybe 2:12 in the morning, or at least that's what I thought until I reached for the clock and saw nothing. It didn't blink, it didn't glow, just a dead black square in the middle of the pale room. I swung my legs off the bed and noticed the air felt different. It wasn't colder or warmer. It had a weight to it, like the house had been packed into skin-tight silence. The usual neighborhood hum, distant traffic, the refrigerator's steady thrum, was gone. I could hear the house settling, tiny cracks and pops, and that was it. I padded to the window and peered out. The glow was there, washing the backs of the oaks in a kind of milk. It had edges that were too clean for moonlight. Moonlight in October is sharp and pale and comes from everywhere. This was a circle, concentrated, as if someone had set a lamp just over the tree line. "Hello?" I said, more because my voice felt like an anchor than because I expected an answer. The house stayed quiet. Rusty, my neighbor's German shepherd that usually barked once or twice at strangers in the night, didn't stir. The thought hit me. Maybe someone set a generator out back, a crane, a work light. But there was no motor noise to match the glow. No sound at all, really. Even the air felt like it had been vacuum packed. I slipped my feet into sneakers and crept downstairs. The hallway light clicked on when my hand brushed the switch, filling the house with the normal buzz of electricity. The lamp in the living room was off, the TV dark. I killed the overhead and the glow in the room took over, making the furniture look like soft paper cutouts. Outside the front window, the street light at the corner was on, ordinary and orange, but its beam stopped a few yards shy of my yard, where the pale light more or less began. The colors didn't mix. It was as if somebody had painted a bright, clean circle over the trees with a brush and left it there. I opened the front door half an inch at first, like a man who expected to see someone leaning against my porch. The porch was empty. The wooden steps were dull. The glow pooled over the yard, and the fence cast a hard shadow in its edge. The air smelled faintly metallic, nothing like a campfire or headlight glare, just a slight sharpness that made the back of my throat feel dry. "Hello?" I tried again louder. My voice sounded too small on the porch. The glow flickered. That's the first thing I noticed that didn't make sense. Not a steady beam, but a soft, almost imperceptible blinking. Not strobe-like, more like someone breathing in and out. When I said, "Hey," the light dimmed for a fraction of a second and then rose again. I stepped off the porch into the yard, gravel crunching under my shoe, and the sound seemed painfully loud compared to the rest of the world. Up close, the light wasn't a bulb, wasn't a lantern. It was a saturated space of brightness with no hardware visible, no wires, nothing hanging or sitting where you'd expect to find a thing that emits light. I angled my phone and tried to take a picture. The display showed the yard in pale gray, and where the glow ought to have been, there was almost nothing. Just a blank that my camera refused to translate. I tapped the shutter a dozen times and got nothing but grain and the normal orange spill of the streetlight, as if the light was a negative the camera couldn't hold. I shouldn't have done it, but I called my sister. She answered on the first ring, voice asleep and thick. "Dan, it's 2 a.m. "What?" I told her there was a light in my yard, and she said she lived 50 miles away and couldn't see anything from there, which I knew, but I wanted someone to hear me say it out loud. I shut off the phone and the glow thinned again. That made my skin crawl. I went to the garage and hit the switch for the floodlight out back. Nothing happened. I flicked the breaker for the back porch on and off. The garage lights stayed dark. Inside the house, everything electrical was normal. Kitchen light, hall lamp, the little blue glow of the smoke detector. But out back, the glow persisted independent of my wiring. It was not the kind of thing I could fix by flipping breakers. I stood by the fence with my hand on the wood. The oaks at the edge of the property shivered slightly in a wind I could feel on my face, but not here. The glow sat just above their crowns, a perfect orb now, brilliant enough that when my eyes adjusted, I could see the branches silhouetted through the brightness. It didn't hum or vibrate. There was a pressure I could feel, though. Not in my ears, but under my ribs, like the same small tightness you get for a big roller coaster drop. I realized my jaw had clenched. At some point, Rusty over the fence started whining, a drawn-out, worried sound that made me want to step back. His owner's porch light came on, and a shadow crossed the doorway. Old Mrs. Perry stuck her head out, hair wrapped in a scarf. She squinted in the direction of my yard, then looked at me as if to ask if I had power problems. "Dan," she called. "Everything okay over there?" "It's fine," I said too quickly. "I don't know." The glow dimmed a fraction again, just enough that Mrs. Perry took another step out and peered. Maybe she thought it was a bonfire somewhere, a kid with a flashlight, but she didn't say anything else and went inside. I thought about getting the binoculars, about climbing up on the shed roof for a better look. I thought about going for a walk down the lane to see if anyone else had something set up beyond the trees. My feet stayed planted like there was glue on the grass. Then, quiet, and exactly in the middle of the dark, a new sound arrived. A thin, high note like someone scraping a wine glass along the rim. Not loud, but present and clear, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It made my teeth feel faintly sensitive. The glow tightened, like a lens coming into focus. For a moment, I had the absurd impression that if I took a step closer, the light would be startled, that maybe whatever was making it was conscious of my presence. I whispered, "Hey!" The light drew up as if inhaling. For a second, it intensified to a bright white that washed down the fence and into the yard. I could see small motes of dust in the air, like tiny islands caught in the beam. And then, as smoothly as a hand sweeping a tabletop, it slid up above the trees. It moved without rustle, without wind, rising like a balloon, but with none of the slow wobble that implies buoyancy. It held above the tree line for one long beat, and then, no sound, no flash, it was gone. Nothing left behind but the ordinary night. When the glow vanished, the normal neighborhood noise slid back in like water returning to a drained pool. The distant car became audible, a radio playing a brittle country song 50 yards away. Mrs. Perry's dog barked twice, like someone turning a dial. My own breath sounded too loud in my ears, and then I felt foolish and small, because what else was there to feel? I checked the clock on the nightstand again. It was dark, impassive as before. My phone's camera had a single blurred frame where the glow had been, and otherwise nothing weird. The image looked like a smear of film grain. I went back inside and closed the door, locking it with a finger that felt heavier than usual. In the living room, I turned on the TV to fill the quiet. It came on with morning infomercials and bright, ordinary sound, and the house settled back around the mundane. I tried to name what I'd seen with something practical: searchlight, drone, a neighbor with a handheld lamp, but none of those ideas clicked. The way it had zeroed out when I filmed it, the way it rose without kicking the air, none of it matched. I lay awake the rest of the night, listening to the normal sounds of the house, counting the refrigerator cycles like the beats of a metronome. Every so often, I crept to the window and looked out. The tree line was back to black with regular moonlight, the yard ordinary and shadowed. By dawn, the world had rearranged itself into the usual economy of tarmacs and coffee smells. Neighbors went about their routines. Mrs. Perry hung laundry. Rusty barked at a squirrel. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the thing might have been a trick, a reflection of car headlights from a distant passing truck, a camera quirk, a dream that had bled into waking. I went to work that morning and told nobody the whole story. At lunch, I checked the photos again and the video, scrolling through tiny frames looking for evidence. No helpful frames, only the same laughable grain. A couple of coworkers joked about sleep deprivation, but otherwise, the day was ordinary. In the evening, I walked the dog down the lane and looked at the trees from outside my fence. They were the same as always. Oaks with the same crooked branch, the same fence pickets, the same scrape in the sidewalk from a lawnmower. No marks, no scorch, no footprints. There's nothing dramatic to close this with. The house still has power. The clock on the nightstand works when I plug it in. When the sky is clear, I look up and pick out familiar constellations. Sometimes at night, I find myself standing at the window watching the dark line of trees, waiting for a pulse. Mostly nothing happens. But a few nights later, Mrs. Perry mentioned over the fence that she'd woken to a funny light, and that Rusty had been restless. She'd shrugged it off over tea. She didn't ask for details. I didn't volunteer them. I'm home. The house is ordinary in the day. The clock actually works now. I sleep in the same bed I woke in, and sometimes I wake in the dark and find the room ordinary and not glowing at all. Other times I wake to the faint shape of a pale wash and go to the window to find my yard as it was that first night, a little too clean in the moonlight, and I stand there and wait for the possibility that the tree line will light up again. It hasn't, at least not yet. But the memory of that orb and the way the air felt around it is a small, precise thing in me, like a thread I can't pull taut or cut. I was walking Otis along the Mill River when the reflection started acting wrong. It was early, the kind of gray that sits on the water until the sun decides what to do, and there was a thin fog that made the world soft around the edges. Otis was on his leash, nose to the ground like he always was, picking up whatever rabbits had left on the path the night before. The river that morning looked like a long sheet of glass, the oaks and the old stone bridge mirrored perfectly, no ripples except where the occasional carp broke the surface. At first, I didn't notice the reflections so much as the sound, or the lack of it. The town's cars that you usually hear faintly over the trees were muffled as if someone had put a pillow over everything. Even the gulls were quiet. One gave a single call and then stopped. That alone put a low pressure in the back of my head, that the same tightness I get before a storm. Otis pulled me to a spot where the bank dropped a little and stopped, ears up, staring at the water. He wasn't growling or barking. He just stood like a statue, all four legs rigid. I looked where he was looking and thought, for a second, that a breeze had just moved the trees because the mirrored branches on the water were out of sync with the real branches above them. A whole section of reflection, 3 trunks and a clump of reeds, slid a hair forward on the surface, then held. It looked like someone had nudged the reflection and left it out of place. I laughed at myself, the nervous kind where you try to reset your breath. Maybe light through the fog, I told Otis. Maybe the current downriver had just shifted and the angle of the trees with it. But then the reflection of the sky near the bridge blinked, not in the slow way clouds do, but in a tiny, tight way, like an eye closing and opening. The real sky didn't change. I took a step closer to the bank. The water was that brown black of riverbeds, but where the strange shift had happened, the surface held the light like a pane of polished metal. I threw a pebble out with no thought of hunting monsters, just to break the weirdness, small, stupid human gestures. The pebble made a clean circle of ripples where it landed, but they stopped dead a half second later as if the surface suddenly regained a stiffness. The ripples smoothed out and the reflection reset, exactly aligned again, as if nothing had happened. Otis whined then, short and high, and looked back at me. "Okay," I said. He doesn't usually look to me for leadership when there's nothing in sight, but that morning he did, like he was asking what the plan was. I clipped his leash back on tighter and kept walking, but my steps got smaller and slower. The path along the river was empty. The usual dog walkers were home, cars in driveways still warm. The next odd thing was the ducks. A line of mallards that normally bobbed and fussed down by the old stone outflow were all lined up on the far bank, heads tucked facing upstream in that rigid, attentive way animals do when they hear something we can't. They didn't paddle away when a heron took off. They just shifted their weight in unison toward the same point in the water, like they'd been cued. Then, as if someone held a match and lit a dot above the surface, a pale orb rose out of the river. It wasn't a splash, not a ball of steam. It simply sat up above the water maybe a foot or two and hovered, a clean round of light that didn't burn or glare. The color was peculiar. Not warm like a lantern, not cold like metal. It was a thin milk of white that made the fog around it look thicker, as though it carried its own mist. I froze. Otis's leash tightened in my hand. The orb did not make a sound. The only noise was a far-off dog bark that seemed miles away. The orb floated there, motionless, and the reflections on the water rearranged themselves so the orb had its own perfect mirror directly beneath it. Except the mirror on the water didn't look quite right. It trembled, barely perceptible, like a low-frequency vibration, while the orb above stayed still. It started to move downstream, not by drifting with the current, but floating slowly, carrying the mirror with it. There was no wind. The tree branches overhead didn't shiver. It was the strangest way I've ever seen something travel. A slow, smooth glide, straight down the channel, the light washing over the stone edgings and under the bridge, making the surfaces look like they'd been painted in quick, white strokes. Fish broke the surface sometimes in the bright wake, but they didn't scatter as you'd expect. They popped up and went under again like clockwork. I wanted to be closer, to just touch it or scoop a cup of river and bring the water up to it. I felt dangerous wanting that. I took 2 steps down the bank, and the orb seemed to pause like it noticed my motion. It didn't react the way a wild thing would. It didn't recoil. It simply eased a fraction left, keeping a respectful distance from the bank, and continued its quiet procession. I dug my phone out because I thought rationally for a second. Record. It's an almost stupid reflex, but who else do you tell if you don't have a clip? The screen lit up and the recorder showed the river, the bridge, and a bright pin where the orb was. I filmed for maybe 10 seconds. When I played it back immediately, the orb was a smear on the screen, less defined than what I saw with my own eyes. The audio track picked up nothing but the crack of a twig and Otis's breathing. No hum, no field noise. Without meaning to, I whispered, "Stay," to Otis. He obeyed as if he knew to. He sat down and watched the orb too, head tilting occasionally. People who have dogs know when they're watching something that matters. That small, attentive posture is honest in a way our own faces aren't. The orb drifted under the small footbridge used by runners and disappeared for a beat, reappeared on the other side. Part of me wanted to follow along the bank under the bridge, to lose sight of it deliberately, and then find it again on the far side, to prove I hadn't dreamt that pale globe. But the path under the bridge was narrow and slick with mud, and the sense of being watched rose again like a tide. I stayed put. As it passed beneath the bare roots of an old willow, the orb gave off a faint pulse, a tiny thinning of the light like someone breathing out, and for the length of a long breath, the little lane filled with the smell of iron, sharp and cold. It reminded me of the smell you get when a storm is about to break and someone flips a breaker. Electrical, metallic, not unpleasant but unmistakable. Otis twitched, hair along his back bristling. A man walking with a stroller came along the path heading the other way and stopped dead when he saw the light. He stood there, the toddler bunched in his coat, and watched until the orb passed. The man didn't say anything to me and I didn't say anything to him. We both let the silence hang there like a thin membrane. By the time the orb slid out from under the last low-hanging willow and reached a bend in the river, it had narrowed into a ribbon, the bank steepening. In the bend, the water quickened and the orb picked up a fraction of speed, like it was losing patience. It continued until it came to a place where the river narrowed under old railway pylons and, almost without warning, it simply thinned and vanished. One instant, a white circle sat over the dark water, and the next there was nothing but fog and the ordinary gray. When the light went, I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with cold. The sounds came back in layers. A rooster's distant crow starting the morning somewhere. Leaves scuffing in the trees, a bicycle bell. The man with the stroller moved on. The toddler yawned. Otis shook himself and sent a scatter of beads of water flying across my jacket. I checked my phone. The clip I'd made had that smear and then a gap where the light had ended. It was easy to dismiss as camera artifact. My hands had stopped shaking so I could hold the leash with both. I wanted to tell someone, to call the park office, the police, anyone who might say, yes, that's not normal, or even no, that's a trick of light. But when I tried for the number, the screen said no signal, a thin band of white letters over black. The man with the stroller walked away, turned his head as if seeing me one last time, then kept going down the path. He didn't look frightened, just puzzled in the way you are when clocks behave badly. Otis pulled at the leash then, as if to go home. I let him lead. The walk back felt longer, like I was carrying the morning ahead of me. Houses were waking up. Someone in a second-floor window opened a blind. I kept glancing at the river through the trees, but the smooth sheet looked like any other day. The ducks were back to bobbing, ordinary and noisy. The world had rearranged itself into mundane motion and left me holding the residue. When I got home, I made coffee the way I always do, hands moving by habit, only half listening to the kettle. I fed Otis. He ate like nothing had happened, and then curled up in his usual spot near the door. I didn't call anyone. Saying the words out loud made them feel bigger. I texted a friend, "River weird this morning." She sent back a thumbs up and a joke about me joining a cult. I should have pressed, asked if she'd seen anything, but my thumbs stalled. All day I kept catching myself at windows, glancing down toward the river as if it might return in an afternoon crack of light. Nothing did. In the evening I walked Otis again, the fog lifted, the moon distant, and the river moved like water when it's not pretending to be a mirror. I slept with the window slightly open and the house sounded normal. The neighbor's late-night TV, the hum of the fridge. The light never came back. I was home and the world folded back into itself, the way a page closes over a place you'd been reading. I woke to the sound of something walking around my tent. At first, I thought it was a fox, those little quick steps that tap the ground when something small pads by. But when I rolled over and checked my watch, it was well past midnight, and the step had a slow, deliberate timing to it, like somebody testing the soil. My name is Marcus. I go out alone sometimes, sleep under canvas, because the desert has a way of sorting the weak out. This night, I was camped on a broad flat just beyond a wash in the northern Mojave. The moon had gone down. The stars were brutal, the kind that made the inside of your eyelids feel lit. I unzipped the tent quietly and stuck my head out. The wash was a black cut across the plain, and the ground around my little dome of fabric was the pale chalk of dried sand. The beam from my headlamp lit up a ring of grit and nothing else. No animal figure, no glint of eyes. The steps kept up, slow and careful, moving around and around the tent as if studying it. When I stepped out and swept the lamp wider, the wash showed nothing but scrub. I walked a slow circle, the headlamp painting the world in white arcs, and heard the steps stop for a moment, then start again on the other side. I'd camped in places where you hear things and later chalk them up to coyotes or the wind. But the pattern of the steps wasn't right for pause. They were very light, almost weightless. Each contact with the sand sounded like a soft pop, a small punctuation. They never crunched in the brittle way boot prints do. They came at a pace that made me think of a person listening, not walking. I didn't call out. I didn't want a human answer to turn into a dangerous encounter. Most nights I keep my mouth shut and my lamp dim. Instead, I sat on my cooler with the light low and listened. The air was cool, the kind that hits your face like a dry hand. The quasi-regular tapping moved around the tent 3 or 4 times and then slowed to nothing. I told myself whoever it was had walked away. I lay back down and tried to sleep. I didn't get comfortable. My camp stove was within arm's reach, and every time a breeze shifted the tent wall, I tensed up like I'd been sleeping with one hand on a switch. The stars angled in and out through the nylon, faint pinpricks that seemed closer than they should have been. At one point, I heard a faint metallic sound, like a thumb running along the rim of a can, far off, then gone. I told myself that was the wind catching a rusted fence somewhere miles away. After what felt like an hour, the steps started again. This time, they weren't pacing the tent as before. The rhythm was a slow arc that began near my cooler and kept moving out into the wash, tracing a shallow semicircle and coming back as if to check twice. I took the headlamp and unzipped the door a little, enough so my hand could reach the zipper, but not wide enough to let the night in. When I poked the lamp out, the beam caught nothing but surface. The sand was smooth and unbroken. I sat there for a long time watching the sand and listening to my breathing. My watch said 2:05. The steps went on for a while and then stopped like a curtain falling. Sleep finally snagged at me sometime after 3. I woke with the feeling that somebody was waiting for me to move. The tent felt thicker than it ought to be, like air pressed against the fabric. I unzipped and pushed the flap aside. The sky had that flat light that comes just before dawn, a pale gray that eats shadow. The wash was a flat plain of sand. My dog would have been tracking a mess of prints and droppings, but there was no sign of passage. No larger animal prints, no tire ruts. The only marks around the tent were my own, where I'd trod when I checked the perimeter. I bent to my coffee kettle because motion fixes the brain. I boiled water, sat on the cooler, and watched the horizon turn from gray to pink. It wasn't until the sun cleared the low hills that I noticed the sand. Around the tent in the half-moon wash I'd walked in the night before, the ground was perfectly smooth except for a line of tiny depressions. They were small, smaller than a thumbprint, about the size of a dime or a penny, and perfectly circular. Someone had pressed a neat row of them into the crust of the desert, like someone had gone around with a tiny stamp and set a pattern. They weren't random. They traced a shallow arc that passed close to the tent, dipped slightly away, then returned in a mirrored arc on the other side. The circles were uniform in depth and width, each one a clean scallop in the sand with no dragging marks, nothing to show how it had been made. I crouched and ran a finger around one. The sand inside the depression was packed down in a way that suggested pressure from above and equally clean release. No scuffing on the rim, no loose sand piled on one edge. The pattern made no sense for animal prints. Birds leave little troughs. Beetles make scratchy lines. Human toes or boot prints should have a heel drag and asymmetry. These were perfect ovals, symmetric, placed like punctuation. I walked the arc and counted 38 on one side, 38 on the other, a neat bilateral symmetry. They bent away from the tent at 3 feet and came back the same distance on the other side. They stopped at the scrub line as if an invisible boundary had been respected. Shit. That was the first real thought that made any noise. I took some pictures because that's what you do now, the witness-making reflex. The photos looked ordinary. Pale ground, a tent, a circle of small holes like coin impressions. The resolution on my phone didn't betray the strangeness the way my eyes saw it, and when I zoomed in to check edges, all I got was grain. That always creeps me out, the world recording less than my memory. I went to the edge of the frost run at the wash and looked back. In the dim light of the rising sun, the tiny circles made a mandala of method, a careful punctuation around the place where I'd slept. The rest of the flat was unmarked. No footprints leading away, no broken scrub, no sign anyone had stood there with a hand tool. I thought of children playing with cookie cutters and dismissed it because there were no other signs. No litter, no cigarette butts, not even the drag of a sleeping bag. I thought of mining equipment, someone with a punch tool, but the nearest stallion roads were 2 miles off and there was no vehicle track heading in. I walked the pattern twice more. The morning was getting warmer by degrees and I could hear the junction road a mile off, trucks coming through occasionally. The desert had that ordinary soundtrack, occasional birds, the distant mechanical downdraft of semi-trailers. But the circle pattern held a quiet geometry, like someone had measured the sand with a delicate instrument. I went back to camp and packed with my hands, moving without thinking. There's a practical muscle for packing a tent before the sun cooks everything, and I ran through it. The tent came down, the poles slipped, the nylon folded into its bag like always. But I kept glancing at the little depressions. They stayed put until I stepped off the flat and started down the wash. When I reached the county road and climbed into my truck, I took one last look. From the cab, I could see the arcs like faint stitches on the sand, symmetric and patient. I took a photo through the windshield because the sight felt like evidence you wouldn't be able to describe later. At the ranger station, I told the woman at the desk what I'd found. She was polite, asked the usual questions, exact location, time, had I left anything, then took a note. Her tone was steady. Animals do funny prints, she said, which satisfied nothing and was better than alarm. She filed my note and then asked if I wanted a map. I said no, thanks, and drove the 2 hours home. On the way back, my mind kept reeling through possible explanations. A moth with a weird foot, a bird unlike anything I knew, some human with a hidden punch tool pricking out a pattern in the night for reasons they'd never explain. Each idea folded in on itself. The only firm thing was that the sand had been untouched except for those tiny rings, and that whatever had made them had moved with a precision I didn't recognize. I slept in my own bed that night and made coffee in the morning like I always do. The world around me returned to its usual textures, subway noise, the neighbor's kids' music, the click of my kettle. The tiny depressions stayed as a small, persistent thing in my head. I told one friend the story over lunch. He laughed, asked if I'd been drinking, and that was the end of that for most people. For me, it nested into a quiet category of things I hadn't expected to find in the world, small, ordered, and unexplained. I still have the photos on my phone. When I look at them, the circles look like coin impressions in an empty yard, ordinary and cheap. When I close my eyes, I can still see the arcs etched around where I slept, and I remember the sound of the steps that had circled the tent in the dark. Not the howl of a coyote, not the scuff of boots, but soft, regular taps like something testing for noise. I drove past that flat a few weeks later. The wind had smoothed the cuts away, and the desert kept its secrets like a patient thing. I drove home and fixed the sink in my kitchen and mowed the lawn. Whatever had been out there, I'd been close enough to notice and not close enough to understand. I found it the moment I lifted the print from the tray. We'd run the parade pictures through the Times little darkroom that Sunday evening because Earl Jensen, who shoots everything from town council fights to the high school football team, would want a fresh set for Monday's front page. I lowered the print into the fixer, counted strokes with the tongs like I always did, and then I pulled it up and held it to the red lamp. There, in the corner above the floats and the bunting and the mayor's hat mid-flight, was a perfect silver disc. It wasn't a smear or a crease. It was round, clean, a tiny coin of brightness caught over Main Street, high above the band. My first thought was a pinhole in the enlarger or a bit of dust on the negative, so I set the print aside and ran the negative on a contact sheet. The same shape showed up on the negative, black on clear, where the sky should have been blank. Earl swore he hadn't seen a thing when he took the shot. He remembered the crowd and the clowns and that Mrs. Pennington's float had lost its skirt on the last block. No mention of anything in the sky. The town had been a little odd for a week before the parade, little things that everyone passed off. The clock in the courthouse tower had stopped for a few minutes one Thursday morning. When it started again, it was a minute fast and nobody could say why. The milkman swore his horse had stood staring at nothing at the edge of the Benson field for an hour, head high, ears tight. On Friday evening, the radio in the barber shop filled with a high whining note that made the razors vibrate. Old Mr. Hargreaves swore he'd heard it, and when I went by the shop later, the mirrors held a ring of condensation like someone had breathed on them. None of that seemed connected until Sunday. The parade was full of the usual. Veterans in caps, a school band that played better than they ever do under pressure. Children with cotton candy, a float with a lot more hay than anchors. The sky had been clear and blue, nothing to warn you off. Still, people made little jokes afterward about 50 years of tradition and a new trick. Someone said the lights at the soda fountain had dimmed when the band hit the cornet solo. A girl at the bakery swore her sister's compass spun for a second when they stood in the square. We were all saying small things like that because it made them sensible and laughable. I took the contact sheet back to Earl and we compared negatives under a loupe. The camera was a speed graphic he'd had since the war. He'd cleaned the lens that morning and the shutter was the same it always was. The disc appeared only in that single frame, not in the ones before or after, though Earl had fired the camera half a dozen times as the mayor waved. We examined the film for scratches, for a double exposure, for any sign of tampering. There were none. The density on the negative where the disc was matched a solid object, not a flare or a scratch. Lens flare, maybe, Earl said finally, but his voice was too quick. He'd put a lot of pride in his eyes. It sat on him wrong to be puzzled. I ran the print again in different paper stock, adjusted the contrast, held it up to the window in the newsroom where the light was honest. The disc was there every time, round and unobtrusive, and wrong. The editor, Martin Klein, asked me to hang one on the proof board so he could decide if it was front page material. We published it above the fold with a headline about the parade and a picture credit to Earl. I expected the phone to start ringing, people to call in and tell us they'd seen nothing but rain or the mayor's dog. Instead, the newsroom stayed oddly quiet. The strangest part was what happened after the paper hit the street. Folks came by to buy copies and flip the page, and almost everyone I spoke to remembered the parade. Who'd waved, who'd missed the march, but no one remembered a disc in the sky. Lillian, who runs the post office, laughed and said, "You city boys, always spotting something." Joe Carver, who'd been standing on the corner selling hot dogs, watched the picture with the paper limp in his hand and said, "Flat, I don't see it." When I asked, "You weren't watching the sky then?" he shrugged. "I was watching the float with the goats," he said. "You think I would miss something like that?" Earl's cousin snapped a roll of amateur shots from the courthouse roof, the very place where, if anything had been in the sky, someone might have seen it head on. When the cousin came in with his prints the next day, the disc wasn't in any of them. Neither was it in the photo taken by a traveling photographer who'd been selling portrait sittings on the sidewalk. We scavenged every camera in town. Kids Brownies, the high school yearbook photographer, Mr. Klein's son who'd come by for a free copy, and on every sheet the sky was the ordinary blue it had been that day. Rumors spread in the manner of rumors, slowly at first, Then, with the kind of insistence only a small town can muster. Somebody swore a man in a gray suit had been watching the parade from a second-story window and had smiled like someone who knew something. Nobody could agree on which building. A woman at the library said the church bell had rung once by itself in the afternoon. The feed store's radio played white noise for a minute and then came back with the noon program as if it had been unbothered. People remember these things and flatten them down because life needs seams to hold. I kept staring at the print. I started to feel like it had been printed for me alone, like a private note folded into the public paper. I sent the negative to a man in Columbus who runs a lab. He was polite and thorough, and he called me a week later to say he'd found nothing wrong with the emulsion or the development. No splice, no tamper, Harold, he said over the line like a man reading instructions. Looks genuine to me. He wouldn't offer why it might have been there. There were other small oddities after that. My grandfather's pocket watch, which had run obediently for 30 years, skipped a beat the next morning and then went on. Mrs. Pennington told me her front yard lamp flickered when she walked past, though the bulb was new. Once, as I was locking up the office, the neon sign above the barber's slit an extra second of buzz and then hummed on steady. People came into the shop and asked in whispers whether the Times had staged some trick to sell papers. I'm not a man to court attention that way, and Martin was less interested in spectacle than in a full report, but the idea settled in like a nettle. Earl started to keep a small diary after the paper ran. He wrote down the times he'd left the house where he'd been, what the sky had looked like when he passed certain blocks. He photographed the courthouse roof at different hours for a week. We took the contact sheet and held it under different lamps and compared densities and grain. Every technical avenue ran into the same blank wall. The disc was on that frame, and that frame alone. I went downtown and asked folks if they had seen anything in the sky, any little gleam or movement, and they blinked and said no. And then they looked at each other as if maybe they didn't want to add anything to what the paper had said. Small towns have their ways of erasing oddness. If nobody mentions it, perhaps it never happened. That may be how people keep the world tidy. A month later, someone from the state paper called. They wanted the story. They wanted the negative. Martin refused to sell. He said a paper's job is to ask and to print what it finds. He was old in the way editors are old, careful with facts and harder on his conscience. We ran it, he said. We did our job. We kept the negative in the safe behind the desk. Life moved on. The 4th came and went, and we printed fireworks pictures. Earl kept shooting. Sometimes he complained about the odd frame and then laughed and moved on. Folks who'd bought the paper that day still put it on their mantles. A few of the older men said the disc might have been a balloon, that others a trick of light, and anyone with a head for work shrugged it into the day's oddities. The county clerk told me the state police had no record of anything in the sky that day, and their airplanes, if they had been up, would have been noted. Every so often, someone would come in and glance at the framed front page on the wall behind my desk. "Did you really see that?" they'd ask, not wanting to embarrass themselves. I would hand them a fresh cup of coffee and tell them what I knew. The negative in the safe, Earl's clean shutter, the contact printed on the paper that morning. They'd nod and put the cup down politely and then change the subject. I could tell they wanted to keep their day unruffled. I do not know what the disc was. I do not have a theory that fits all the little facts, the stopped clock, the radio hiss, the horse that wouldn't move. All I have is that one clean image in the corner of a page, and the memory of standing under the red lamp, holding the print, thinking the sky had been far older for a second than the town was ready to admit. I hung the print in the back of the office where the light is steady and the paper dry. People come by, look at it, and some of them ask me why I left it there. I tell them, half in jest, that a picture is a good thing to keep, whether it explains itself or not. Then I go back to the proofs, the obituaries, the town council minutes, and I do the work of the morning paper because bills don't wait for wonder. The disc stays, round and small in the corner, waiting like any ordinary photograph waits to be noticed again. I was on the night patrol out near East Hollow Road when I first noticed it. My name's Jared Collins. I'm a deputy in a small county up in Missouri, and this stretch of farmland is usually quiet at night. Too quiet sometimes. It was around 10:30, fog rolling in off the creek, headlights cutting thin lines through it. I'd been on for about 4 hours just circling the back roads when I saw something odd near Miller's farm. At first, I thought the fog was playing tricks on me. There was a light in the field, faint, almost like it was hovering above the ground, moving slowly along the corn. I slowed down, rolled the window down. The air smelled normal, wet dirt and corn. But then I noticed the animals. Miller's chickens, usually loud, pecking and clucking even at night, were all huddled near the coop. But they weren't making a sound. Not one peep. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. Then I saw the cows in the back pasture. They were standing near the tree line, perfectly still, staring at something in the field, maybe me, maybe whatever that light was. And Miller's dog, Duke, he was at the edge of the corn, hackles raised, refusing to go any further. I stepped out of the car, fog curling around my boots, and I swear I could hear my own heartbeat. I called Miller on the radio. "Hey, Mark, you around?" Nothing. I tried again, louder, still nothing. The farm was quiet, eerily so. I approached the edge of the cornfield, flashlight in hand, and that's when I saw it. A circle, perfect, flattened corn in a pattern maybe 15 feet across. The light I'd seen earlier wasn't hovering anymore, but the pattern seemed different somehow. Precise, unnatural. I crouched, shining my flashlight over it. The stalks were pressed down in a way that suggested nothing human could have made it. No footprints, no tractor tracks, nothing. Just the flattened circle. I stepped back, Duke growling now, low and deep. I shined my light around, trying to see if anything else was moving. That's when I noticed the animals again. The chickens were still silent, standing as if frozen. The cows hadn't moved an inch. Even the barn cats were sitting in place, heads slightly tilted, watching. I waved my flashlight at them. Nothing. I called the station, just for the sake of checking in. "Unit 5, can you run a quick check, see if anyone's reported anything unusual near Miller's farm?" Static. Then a voice, low, almost underwater. "Negative, nothing reported. Be advised," and the line cut off. I took a step closer to the circle. The corn under my feet felt strange, softer than usual, not wet or muddy, just different. My stomach tightened like I'd swallowed something wrong. Duke whimpered behind me. I backed up, thinking maybe I should just report this in the morning. But then I saw movement in the fog, a faint shadow at the edge of the circle. I couldn't tell what it was. It didn't walk or run, just shifted, blurred at the edges like it wasn't fully there. I felt a pressure in the air, subtle but pressing. I'm not the most superstitious guy, but I took a step back, and that's when the pattern seemed to change. The flattened corn rippled like a small wave moving through the stalks. I froze, staring. It didn't go away, didn't rise, didn't flatten more, it just shifted. I called Miller again. This time he answered, voice groggy. "Jared, you okay? What's going on?" I tried to explain, but the words sounded stupid even as I said them. By the time I got to the part about the animals, he interrupted. "Animals acting funny? Yeah, I saw that earlier. My cows wouldn't move for hours. Chickens weren't making a sound. Duke wouldn't go near the corn at all. Thought I was losing it." I wasn't. The dogs, the cows, the chickens, they were all behaving like something had altered the environment, altered their senses. I walked along the edge of the circle, shining my flashlight into the fog. Every time I thought I could see a figure, a shadow, it would dissolve, leaving nothing but mist. I stayed until about 1 a.m., taking notes. The animals didn't move, the circle didn't disappear, and the pressure in the air never let up. When I got back in my car, I glanced once more over the field. The circle was perfectly round, the corn slightly rippled, almost like it was breathing. I drove home slowly, Duke in the passenger seat, keeping low, ears flat. Next morning, Miller and I returned. The circle was still there, but some of the corn had started to rise. Not completely, just adjusting. By midday, it looked almost normal, though you could still make out the pattern if you squinted. The animals were back to their usual behavior. Chickens clucking, cows wandering, dogs running circles around the pasture. I kept driving past that field at night for a few weeks after. Every time, new circles would appear. Animals would act strangely near them, silent, still, hesitant. The fog, the pressure, the shifting stalks, it was always there. I reported it in writing to the station just for the record, but no one seemed to care. It didn't make sense. Still doesn't. I haven't gone out there alone since. The circles keep appearing, mostly overnight, mostly near the same stretch of road. Animals still behave oddly when they're nearby. I drive past, glance from the road, and keep moving. I don't know what's making them, or why the corn seems aware. But I know one thing. You don't walk into those circles, not fully, and you don't wait around. Whatever's there, it's patient, and it notices. I make my reports, I write my notes, and I try to sleep at night. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see the circle, and I can still hear the silence of the animals. All of them, frozen, waiting, watching. And I know if I went back too close, I'd feel it again. That subtle pressure, the ripple through the corn, and whatever it is would know I was there. I was finishing my last round at the industrial park around 3:30 a.m., just pushing a mop through the main lobby. The fluorescent lights buzzed in that low, uneven rhythm you get when they're too old, and the hum from the HV made it feel like the building itself was breathing. It was cold for early September, the kind of night that still carries a late summer warmth, but sneaks in a sharp bite whenever a door opens. I had my headphones in, playing an old country station on my phone, just enough to keep my mind off the emptiness of the place. It's always quiet that late, too quiet. And that night, it was quieter than normal. I noticed it when I stepped out of the east side service door to grab the trash from the loading dock. The lot was empty, like always, but something about it felt wrong. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought someone had slipped out of a car or was hiding behind a truck. A figure glowed faintly, pale and white, and it moved across the lot like it wasn't touching the ground. Not walking, exactly, sliding almost. I froze. The shape was vaguely human, but it was like it was wrapped in light or fog. I squinted, thinking the reflection from the overhead security lights had gone weird, but every light in the lot was steady and the glow didn't match any of them. It passed behind a line of trailers and just disappeared. No sound at all. No crunch of gravel, no car engine, nothing. I stood there for a while, just staring, waiting for it to reappear, but it didn't. My first thought was that I'd imagined it, maybe caught a reflection on my glasses or a trick of the shadows, but my stomach had that tight, cold twist you get when you know you didn't imagine it. I tried to shake it off and finished my rounds, though I kept glancing out the windows. Around 5 a.m., I went outside to lock up the east doors, and that's when I saw something else. A small car parked on the far side of the lot, headlights off, engine quiet. I hadn't noticed it when I'd come in at 11 p.m., and there was no one in sight. I figured maybe a coworker had left it overnight. Didn't make sense, but I didn't think much of it at first. The lot's big enough that people sometimes sneak in to sleep or just park for a while. I finished locking up and walked back to my own car, trying to ignore the creeping feeling in my chest. Around 6 a.m., the sun was just starting to touch the horizon, washing the lot in pale light. I got to my car and froze again. 2 men were standing there right by my driver's side, both dressed in black suits that looked new, pressed, hats. Their faces were pale, almost featureless in the dawn light, and they didn't look like anyone I recognized from the park. "Morning," one said. His voice was calm, even like reading a script. "Were the security lights malfunctioning last night?" I blinked. I don't think so." I kept my keys in my hand. "I didn't notice anything. Everything looked fine." The second man nodded slowly. "Good, we just wanted to check. Very easy for something to go unnoticed when the building's empty." I nodded, feeling stupid and nervous. My eyes flicked between them and my car. "Right?" There was a pause. They didn't smile, they didn't fidget, just stared like they were expecting me to say more. I didn't. My throat went dry. "You're the janitor?" the first one asked. I swallowed. "Yeah." "Nothing else unusual?" the second asked. I hesitated. I wanted to tell them about the glowing figure. Part of me thought I should just run, but something about the way they stood there, too calm, too sure, made me feel like even saying it aloud could get me in trouble. So I just shook my head. They nodded again. "Good. Have a safe day." They walked toward the edge of the lot, moving without turning, keeping that quiet, smooth pace. I watched them go until they disappeared behind the row of trailers. I got in my car and sat there for a minute, hands on the wheel, thinking about the figure I'd seen. The lot had been empty, no cameras showing anything out of the ordinary, and yet I couldn't shake the image. The glow, the way it moved, the way those two men had appeared exactly when I left. When I got home, I told my wife, but she just laughed and said it was a weird dream or maybe a prank. I wasn't so sure. I've worked that night shift for 2 years, and nothing like that had ever happened. Usually, the most interesting thing was a raccoon knocking over a trash bin or some trucker stopping for coffee before dawn. That afternoon, I drove past the park. Everything looked normal. The lights worked. The lot was empty. But I kept thinking about those two men. I tried to convince myself they were just contractors, some kind of security inspectors, but their timing, the questions, they weren't normal. Not that calm, not that precise. A week later, I asked a coworker if anyone had been in the lot early that morning. He shook his head. Nope, didn't see anyone unusual. You sure you weren't dreaming? I said nothing. Sometimes I catch myself looking for them, driving past the park at night, checking the lot. I've seen strange reflections in the windows, shadows that move too smoothly. Once I thought I saw the glowing figure on the edge of the tree line behind the trailers, but it vanished before I could get close. I haven't seen them again, the two men, and I don't know if I want to. But every time I pass that lot or hear the hum of those old fluorescent lights, that tight, cold feeling comes back. I still think about it most nights when I walk out to my car after a shift. The figure, the men, the questions, and I keep wondering what they wanted to know about the lights, about me, about the lot. I keep telling myself I imagined it all. Maybe I did, but I know what I saw, and I know those men were real enough to stand there in front of me, just at dawn, like the world hadn't even noticed them. I drive past the lot slower now, windows up, lights on. I park under a street lamp when I have to go inside at night, just in case. And sometimes, if I catch the corner of my eye just right, I swear I can see that same pale glow sliding across the lot, and I remember that morning, the way the world felt small, quiet, and like it wasn't entirely mine. I never tell anyone at work, never bring it up, but every shift I finish, every quiet lot I leave, I feel the weight of their gaze, even when I'm alone. I was on my little boat, a 24-foot center console named the Minnow, somewhere off the northern coast of Maine. I usually didn't head out past 10 o'clock, but that night I had some fish to clean up from earlier trips, and the moon was almost full, so I figured the light would be enough. The water was calm, the sort that felt almost syrupy in the dead of night, and there was a sharp cold in the air, the kind that sinks into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I'd just gotten the lines in and was rinsing the deck when it happened. At first, I thought it was a lighthouse or another boat, but nothing on the radar. Then a beam of white light, really bright, cut across the water. It came from above the clouds, like a searchlight, but wrong. Too steady, too precise. Not swinging, not blinking, just sliding across the waves as if someone were sweeping them with a ruler. I froze. The beam was cold. I mean, the air around it almost seemed to suck the warmth out of me. My teeth were chattering, and my hands went numb even though I was wearing gloves. The water underneath the light looked like it had been bleached. It wasn't reflecting like moonlight. It was like the water itself had lost color. I tried to get the engine going to move away, but my fingers were slow, fumbling over the controls. Every instinct told me to just get out of there, but I didn't move. The light didn't just shine in one place. It slid in a pattern, almost like it was searching, and I couldn't tell if it was looking for me or for something else. Then, just like that, it clicked off. Not dimmed, not faded, just gone. The darkness returned instantly, thick and wet, like someone had pulled a blanket over the ocean. I sat there shaking, staring at nothing but black waves, trying to rationalize. Maybe a helicopter? Maybe some kind of weather drone? But no noise, not a hum, not a motor, nothing. Just silence and the water. That water. It was normal again, but colder than before, and it didn't make sense. I started heading back to the marina, keeping the engine steady. The waves lapped normally, but the sound felt different, hollow somehow. I tried talking to myself, out loud, to keep calm. I even cursed at the darkness, like shouting could make it less heavy. Nothing changed. A few minutes in, I noticed the fog. It wasn't dense, just a thin veil rising off the water, but it moved unnaturally, almost like it was being pulled along by something. It didn't swirl with the wind, it didn't drift, it just shifted slowly, smoothly, like it had a pattern of its own. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks, eyes adjusting to black water and moonlight, but my stomach told me otherwise. Then I noticed the compass needle flick, just a tiny jump, like someone tapped it, then it snapped back. Twice. 3 times. It never pointed away from north, but it hesitated. That shouldn't happen, especially not this far out with no metal overhead except my boat. I tried to call someone on the radio, the VHF, just to confirm I wasn't losing it. No response, just static. And then the weirdest thing, the static started sounding almost like breathing. Not mechanical interference, but a low, even hiss, like someone was right behind the speaker, inhaling and exhaling. My heart slammed, and I slammed the radio down. I glanced up at the clouds, thick now, low, and then I saw a faint glow behind them, almost imperceptible at first, like a lantern in a foggy window. It didn't move like an airplane light or a buoy. Just hovered, steady, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. No fade, no blink, nothing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I'd been staring at the black water too long, that the cold and fatigue were making me see things. I kept moving, slowly. But the feeling stayed, like someone or something was watching from above, waiting for me to slip up, waiting to see if I noticed. Every small sound, the slap of a wave against the hull, a gull far in the distance, the motor vibrating, felt amplified. I was on edge the entire way in. Halfway back, I swear I felt the water under the hull shift differently, heavier somehow, like I was moving through a pocket of air and then into a pocket of something else. It wasn't waves or currents I recognized. The boat didn't rock, but the motion in my stomach told me something was off. I slowed down, just floating for a second, and noticed the silence. Not even the hum of the engine seemed right. The ocean around me had this hollow, muted quality, like the world had temporarily lost depth. When I finally saw the lights of the marina, it felt like stepping into a separate universe. Normal, warm, human. I called the harbor master to tell him I'd be in, but I couldn't explain what I'd seen. Who would believe a beam of light cutting across the water, searching? Who would believe the fog moved like it had a mind, the compass flicking, the radio hissing like someone breathing? I tied the boat up and sat in the cabin, staring at the water through the window. Everything looked fine, quiet, peaceful. And yet, I couldn't shake the sensation that part of the ocean I'd been in was different now, like it had been touched by something I couldn't see. I went home after that, warmed up, ate some food, and tried to sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that white light cutting across black water, smooth and relentless. I kept imagining it sliding, always searching, moving with a precision no human could manage. In the morning, I checked the boat. Nothing seemed damaged, nothing out of place. The waterline was normal, no signs anything had been below the surface except me and the usual marine life. Even the fog had disappeared. But I could still feel it in my fingers, in my chest, in the way the air smelled faintly metallic and cold when I breathed. I took the boat out a few nights later, tried to retrace my route. Nothing. No light, no fog, no feeling, just water, black and indifferent under the moon. But the memory stuck, the weight of that moment pressing down. It's been a couple months, and I still think about it. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I imagine that beam sliding across my backyard, searching, precise, silent. I tell myself it was a trick of the mind, or a strange weather phenomenon, or some kind of plane or helicopter I didn't see. But nothing fits perfectly. Nothing explains the cold in the air, the way the water looked drained of color, the way the fog moved, or the radio. I haven't been back out past 10 o'clock since. The boat sits tied up in the marina, quiet. I still go out for day trips, nothing late at night, nothing past the regular routes. But sometimes when I'm alone on the water near dusk, I feel the weight of that beam again, pressing down, and I keep my head down, my hands steady, and I move. I've thought about trying to tell someone, Coast Guard, scientists, even a friend. But who would believe it? Not the way I remember it. It's real to me. That light was real. The cold was real. The silence was real. Everything else, I don't know. And that's the part that sticks the most. Not the beam itself, but that something like it could exist above the clouds, moving with purpose, unseen, and then just stop. I still see flashes of it when I blink. I still hear the faint hissing in quiet rooms, and sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself staring at the sky, wondering if it's watching back.